Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. It's 1:15 in the morning on a Sunday in May. At the Alazan Apache Courts, one of San Antonio's toughest housing projects, 7 teenage boys wearing designer jeans and polo shirts huddle behind the fence and garbage dumpster that separate the rear courtyard from the street. The boys crack jokes and suck down 40-ounce bottles of malt liquor. The cover is decent here. They can see the street through the fence, and they have memorized every car in the neighborhood and its owner. Anyone cruising by looking to shoot somebody would have difficulty aiming into the shadows of the courts. The boys, ranging in age from 16 to 18, are members of 3 different gangs that get along, usually. They lean against the dumpster or sit with their backs against a concrete wall. Just blocks away live their enemies, members of rival gangs from neighboring housing projects, the Casiano Homes, the San Juan Homes, the Villa Vermendi, and the Victoria Courts, all warring fiefdoms clustered on San Antonio's west side. "You always got to watch your back," says one of the boys, a 16-year-old who joined his first gang when he was 11. He chats amiably about what he and his friends do for fun. "We get really drunk," he says. "We get all hyped up, and we do a drive-by or something like that." At that moment, 5 shots rip through the air, and he and the others fall silent. The shots were loud and close. All 7 boys start running through the rear courtyard, toward the gunfire. If the shooters make another pass, the boys can see who it is. The boys backtrack through the soggy yard, where laundry hangs from clotheslines and the grass needs cutting, and they are a little edgier than they were before. Behind a sagging sheet, a dark figure approaches the boys with a gleaming sun in his hand. He yells something in Spanish as he points the gun at them and slides back the chamber. Is this it? The moment is tense, but the boy turns out to be a friend. The others laugh at his performance and return to their spots against the wall and the dumpster, but something has changed. The air is electric. They chuckle and say they are not afraid. "Things like that happen here all the time," says one. Meanwhile, the teenager with the gun paces around the periphery of the group, watching their backs. No one got hurt that night, but the incident brings into relief the 2 San Antonios. One a thriving city of beauty, history, and culture that draws tourists from around the country, and the other a city of warring youths, where small children are killed in their beds by stray gunfire. In 1993, there were 1,262 drive-by shootings reported in San Antonio, which has a population of 935,933. The police department estimates that for every drive-by that is reported, 10 are not. In contrast, Dallas, with a population of 1,007,618, and reported 221 drive-by shootings last year. Fort Worth's police department recorded 186 drive-bys, and in Austin there were an estimated 50. Houston and El Paso don't keep figures on drive-by shootings, but group them with homicides or assaults. People are afraid to go outside. Children are afraid to play outside, says San Antonio Police Officer George Sexton. Until recently, Sexton patrolled Military Drive, a favorite Sunday night cruising strip on the south side where gang members go to meet girls. Gun-toting teens routinely turn the strip into a war zone. Says Sexton, "Drive-bys are the biggest fear we have in this town." Marky sits at the kitchen table of his family's 3-bedroom apartment at the Alazan Apache Courts, where he lives with his mother, elder brother, younger sister, and sister-in-law. His brown eyes are still droopy at 11:15 on a weekday morning because, he says, he heard shots outside his home late last night and got up to investigate. Marky lives on the west side, where the Hispanic gangs predominate. Marky's sister-in-law, who is 21 years old and 7 months pregnant, sits on the couch in the living room watching soap operas on TV. A mirror and a print of flowers on the wall behind here hide only a few of the dozen or so bullet holes in the wall. "The first time we got shot up, it was my mom and her boyfriend sitting in here," Marky says, yawning and rubbing his beefy neck. "The guys who did it were looking for me and my older brother because we're LA boys and these guys were kings. They were forks down and we were forks up." The sign of a pitchfork, made with the thumb, index finger, and middle finger, pointing either up or down, indicates which of the 2 broad alliances of San Antonio's Hispanic gangs a particular gang belongs to. Gangs that use forks down are in the black circle. Those that use forks up are in the blue circle. Wearing colors, such as black or clue bandanas called rags, can also tip off gang members as to who their friends are. And each individual gang has its own set of hand signs, usually the first letter of the gang's name. Marky joined the LA Boys, started by Lanier High School football players who used the Lanier Athletics logo for their name, when he was in the 7th grade. Me and my best friend wanted to get in because they had a lot of parties and a lot of chicks, he says. We had to get rolled and beaten up by about 15 guys in the plaza right here at the courts for initiation, but my dad had always kicked my ass, so I didn't give a shit. This one huge guy looked at my friend Juan, so I thought he was going to hit him, but he went pow and I hit the wall and bounced off it. And he kept hitting me, and I don't know how, but I got up, and they all beat me into a corner. Afterward they said, "You made it. You can cry now." But I didn't want to cry. When Marky was 13, he quit the LA Boys and joined Damage Incorporated. He strips off his shirt to display his tattoos, proof of his allegiance. On his left shoulder is a yellow Tweety bird clutching a handgun, left over from the days when he belonged to the LA Boys. Beneath the heavily armed bird is another tattoo, D-Ink. By the time Marky was 14, he had taken part in several drive-by shootings. Drive-bys are almost always committed by organized street gangs. Anything can trigger a drive-by: a turf battle, a squabble over a girlfriend, throwing hand signs at rival gangs, an initiation, or the sheer thrill of it. Drive-bys start when people from another gang act big shit and be like, "You're nobody," Marky explains, and some people get serious and get out the guns. Gang members get their guns from pawn shops or gun shows. After they pick out their weapons, a companion who is over 21 buys them. "I remember the first time I shot a real gun," Marky murmurs with a faraway look in his eyes. "It's like a high, and you like it, and you want to do it again and again and again." I don't remember doing my first drive-by. That was a long time ago. But I remember using the first Tech 9, a semi-automatic pistol. We were driving around, and we said, "Let's hit up some houses." I was on the passenger side, and they said, "Go, Mark, go." I just shot like that, pow pow pow. Marky points his right hand out to the side and jerks it high in the air. It was kicking, and I didn't know it would do that. My friends thought that was cool, but they were all scared too. Marky says he regrets one drive-by that killed innocent people. We went to the wrong house. It was like the house was all shady and shit. I saw it on the news. They didn't live. I felt bad about it. I didn't want a thing about it. He looks away and frowns. I don't think about it, explaining why he participates in gangbanging. A word that in his milieu describes not gang rape, but a long list of activities that includes beating people up, stealing cars, throwing hand signs to incite rival gangs, and doing drive-bys. Marky says, "It's fun. It's exciting. We get crazy. Everybody thinks I come from a messed up family, and my mom don't love me and shit like that, but that's not it." Still, Marky describes a childhood filled with physical abuse. "My dad used to hit me, and my mother would just watch or go to her room and shut the door. I stole money from my grandmother when I was little to buy soda and candy, $20. She told my dad, and he beat the shit out of me. He always wore boots, so he used to kick me with them. I once told him, 'Hit me when you're sober, why don't you?'" Marky has not seen his father in 4 years. Officer Rick Riojas is a large man who is quick to laugh at any joke, but after 3 years in the trenches of gang warfare in San Antonio, his good humor is wearing thin. "They're all a bunch of dumb kids," Riojas says with a sigh. "They may do some horrible crimes, but it's easy to catch them because they think like kids." The 35-year-old Riojas is a member of the San Antonio Police Department's gang unit, which was formed in June 1991. The gang unit saturates trouble spots with patrolling officers and mobile police stations. Its 16 members photograph every suspected gang member they stop. Then they try to record his name, nickname, address, gang affiliation, and tattoos for a computer database. Police officers say they are making progress. The number of drive-bys reported so far this year is down 40% from last year, when the city averaged 3.5 a day. There are approximately 2,000 hardcore gang members in the city, 2% of the students in middle and high school, according to police department figures, and another 2,500 associates who engage in less violent behavior. The names of the different gangs are as varied as the crimes they commit. Big-time criminals, all violent boys, Hispanics causing panic, brothers taking over, gangers against police, and niggers in charge, to name a few. On the Anglo-North Side, the biggest gangs are the North Side Rollers, the Skinheads, and the Bad Boys Incorporated. Some gangs just go by the crimes they specialize in. burglary rape crew, ATM robbery, church burglars, and dope overthrowing gangsters, who specialize in robbing street drug dealers of their money and narcotics. There are no firm numbers on the thousands of peewees or wannabes, gang affiliates who are either too young or too unpopular to become full-fledged gang members, but who may shoplift, help older teens sell drugs, or spray paint private property with gang graffiti. Of the more than 300 gangs the SAPD has documented, about 100 are active at any one time and capable of doing drive-bys. Some of the younger gang members are the most dangerous, notes Riojas. They feel they have something to prove. After 3 years of roaming the troubled streets of San Antonio night after night, Riojas has little sympathy for the hard luck stories of the delinquent youths. We're not out to help them with midnight basketball games. That's for PAL, the Police Athletic League, he says. By the time they come across our desk, they need to be put away. Cruising the east side in his patrol car, Riojas deciphers the complex hieroglyphics of the gang graffiti that scar the walls of rundown shops and houses, translating the markings into a history of bloody turf battles and kids who fancy themselves young warriors. This is the part of town where the black gangs dominate, and where BK 187 appears in blue on a street sign with a small X painted within the lower circle of the B. Riojas explains, BK means blood killer, so you know it's the Bloods' rival, the Crips, who wrote it, meaning the Kill Bloods. Plus, it's painted in blue, which is the Crips' color. The X inside the B is meant to show disrespect to the Bloods. The number 187 is the California Penal Code for homicide. A lot of San Antonio's gangs trace their roots back directly to California and Chicago. Farther down the street is the graffito CK, for Crip Killer, with a small red X within the C. Riojas points out kids wearing t-shirts and caps with sports team logos. Every athletic team there gets adopted by the gangs, he says. The Crips wear Chicago Bulls t-shirts, the New York Posse likes the Yankees, and the ND Posse wears Notre Dame t-shirts and baseball caps. Even Mickey Mouse and Tweety have become recognized gang symbols, and some San Antonio schools have banned clothing with images of the cartoon characters from their campuses. Like the Hispanic gang members on the west side, the African American gang members on the east side strongly identify with the subdivision where they live. The ETGs, or East Terrace gangsters, and the WCGs, or Wheatley Courts gangsters, even take their names from their turf. However, says Riojas, the black gangs differ from the Hispanic gangs in some respects. The Hispanics have a more traditional type of philosophy, where turf and familia, or the gang, are the most important forces in their lives, he says. The blacks are more individuals, and the gangs are more like a business venture, a way to sell crack cocaine and make money. They are more likely to do a drive-by on someone who is cutting into their business. It is a Friday night of the east side. In front of an elementary school, a gang unit patrol car stops a battered sedan with 4 teenage boys wearing white t-shirts and dark pants for failing to use the turn signal. A quick search of the car produces a Flock 9mm handgun under the back seat. A law passed in 1990 makes possessing a handgun within 100 yards of a school a felony. After the officers handcuff the boys and threaten to bring charge, one of them admits that the fun is his. "We got to protect ourselves from Little Joker and Al Capone," says another, a 16-year-old. "They hate blue. Little Joker'll shoot you for wearing blue dickies. That's why I wear black." The minor with the gun is taken to a Texas Youth Commission detention facility for booking. The others are released. The only place a minor can be detained while awaiting trial is the Behar County Juvenile Detention Center, which has 96 beds. Some 1,900 youths are currently awaiting trial in juvenile court. The overflow are usually sent home and back to the streets. 10 minutes after stopping the 4 boys, the officers pull over another car, this time for expired plates. The driver, a slight, smiling young man, turns out to be the infamous Little Joker, one of the original gangsters, or OGs, who started a gang under the Blood set called the Bloodstone Villains, or BSV. A veteran of the East Side Gang Wars, Little Joker, who is 18, has been shot 9 different times. Parts of Little Joker's right arm look patchy and scarred where skin grafts mark gunshot wounds he received in 1993. The last time he was hit was the day after Thanksgiving, when he was washing his car with some friends and a shotgun blast shattered his left leg. It had to be amputated above the knee. "My friend got shot in the back," he says. "I'm not afraid to die, but anyone who hangs out with me can't be scared either." Little Joker, who has been in gangs since he was 10, says he started off shoplifting and then moved on to burglary and stealing cars. It was fun, he says with a shrug. He has been in and out of juvenile detention several times over the years and has never held a job. Little Joker claims he has retired from gang activity, but says he is still a marked man, since he can't receive the ritual beating from fellow gang members that would let him exit from the gang. I'm one of the OGs. No one touches me, he explains. I can't get rolled out of a gang I started. To drive away, Little Joker has to start his car with a screwdriver. The ignition was cracked open when the vehicle was stolen recently. I can't really get too mad they stole my car, he says. I used to steal cars myself. As soon as Little Joker gets the car started, he peels out. Yeah, he'd better hurry, says one officer. Did you notice all the cars slowing down to check us out? Now they know where he is. He's a moving target. Back at the Alazan Apache courts, 5 girls with long dark hair and bright red lipstick walk the neighborhood streets wearing white t-shirts and baggy jeans slung low, with men's boxer shorts peeking above the waistband. The girls call themselves the ND Chicks, a sort of female auxiliary to the ND Posse, whose sworn enemies are the LA Boys. We mostly have a good time and fight against other gangs like the LA Chicks, says 13-year-old Irene. We don't use guns, we just throw gang signs, and if they want to start fighting, we fight back. The girls say they hone their fighting skills by sparring with the NDs, but they fight only with female gang members. We learn to take the pain from guys, so when we go up against the bigger girls, we can take the pain from them, Irene explains, making a fist with a well-manicured hand. First you hit them in the face to mess them up. We try to punch them so they fall, and we push them, and we start kicking them. We make them kiss the rag. The rag is the green bandana that the NDs have adopted as their colors. The gang's mascot, which shows up in tattoos and graffiti, is Notre Dame's Fighting Irishman, but with a twist. His hands are wrapped around an Uzi. The NDs defend us, they back us up, says Maria, also 13. When other guys mess with us, the NDs get into it for us. The girls attend Tafula Middle School, but they say that since joining the gang, they have skipped a lot of classes and their grades have fallen. Their days are spent hanging with the NDs and smoking marijuana. We get it from the NDs, says Irene. We have parties. Irene lives with her aunt. I got tired of my mom, she says. I left once, and she got made and said, get your clothes and get out. San Antonio and its girl gangs were caught in the glare of the media spotlight last year after Planned Parenthood published its March newsletter. According to the newsletter, girls on the city's west side were being initiated into gangs by having sex with members who were HIV positive. Reporters from all over the world, from Geraldo to the London Times, inundated San Antonio's police department with calls. The SAPD maintains that there is no proof the story is true. The ND Chicks say their initiation is to get rolled in with a beating from female gang members. But none deny that willing girls get passed around among male gang members. You really don't know who had AIDS or not, notes Markey, who says he has participated in threesomes and has pulled trains, lined up with several guys to take turns having sex with one girl. Some of them be young, we call them little hoes, he says. Sometimes we'll say, if you want to hang out with us, you got to have sex with us. Markey admits that some gang members rape girls, but the victims are always drunk or on drugs, so no one would believe them if they told. He adds that his gang, Damage, does not have an auxiliary girl gang. We just play around by calling the girls who hang with us pods, he says. Property of Damage. Jimmy Ibarra has lived his entire life at the Alazan Apache courts and the Casiano homes, and he knows gang life intimately. A 33-year-old ex-convict and former heroin addict, Ibarra pledged his life to helping the kids in his neighborhood after he kicked his habit 5 years ago. He landed his first office job in 1990 as a community education specialist for the STEPS project for high-risk substance abusers. He also supervises youth activities at the Alazan Apache courts. Ibarra spends much of his free time driving around the courts keeping tabs on the teens, passing out condoms, encouraging kids to get free HIV tests at the clinic, and trying to persuade gang members to turn their lives around the way he did. I hang out with them and try to calm them down when they want to fight or do a drive-by, says Ibarra. They laugh at me and tell me I'm old or a Jesus freak, but they don't know that I've been through exactly what they have. It's just that we used to use knives and bats. Now they have guns. As Ibarra steers his Ford Escort through the West Side's dark streets on a Friday night in August, he points out the abandoned house where he and his buddies used to shoot up heroin. The kids trust Ibarra and run up to the car to chat or say hello. He's always here to help us, says Miracle, a 15-year-old former gang member, as she leans into the car. Ibarra has caught up with Miracle outside a teen dance sponsored by Inner City Development, a private organization devoted to helping kids. Still sweating and out of breath from dancing, Miracle squats on the curb and munches hungrily on a Snickers bar that Ibarra has handed her from a box on the back seat. The first 2 buttons of her jeans are undone to make way for her growing belly. She is 5 months pregnant. In this world, the simple rituals of adolescence, going to a party, playing basketball, can turn deadly. Miracle's boyfriend, who is the father of her baby and a gang member who lives at the Alazon Courts, just a few blocks away, did not attend the dance. It's too dangerous for him, Miracle says. There are a lot of other gangs here. Ibarra notices large groups of teenage boys walking around, looking drunk and surly. He talks Miracle and 2 girls from the Alazon Courts into accepting a ride home. To Ibarra, the greatest tragedy of the gang wars is that Hispanics are killing other Hispanics. These kids don't remember the Chicano movement of the 70s, he says. They've never been taught the importance of La Raza, brother helping brother. When you don't have any hope for the future, you fight among yourselves for what little you got. That's what these kids think it takes to be a man. The gang is everything to them. Why should they work if welfare will provide them with everything they need just to lie around on their butts all day? Ibarra says, the way the system is set up has not really helped these people. It has hurt them in the long run. A few blocks from the Alazon Courts are the Casiano homes, known for the huge murals, colorful renditions of Aztec gods and modern-day heroes, painted by graffiti artists on the sides of the 2-story buildings. One tells the story of 12-year-old Jose Rodriguez, Jr., who was fatally shot in 1991 when he tried to quit a West Side gang. The boy had lived with his grandmother, who is depicted weeping beside his coffin. One group of gangs under the Black Circle, including the LA Boys and the West Side Posse, live at the Casiano homes, the Villa Veramendi, and the San Juan homes. But membership in the same alliance doesn't preclude hostilities. In an effort to bring peace, the Good Samaritan Center, a community center adjacent to the Casiano homes, began a gang outreach program in the aftermath of the much-publicized murder of the Rodriguez boy. The program, called Youths in Conflict, is headed by 3 former gang members with master's degrees in social work who hold weekly war councils with gang leaders from the 3 housing projects in an attempt to mediate differences. Mediation may include the time-honored tradition of a fair fight, one-on-one. When we can convince the White Seas to allow 2 individuals who have a disagreement to fight each other fair and square, rather than do drive-bys on each other, we've saved some lives, explains Andy Hernandez, the director of the Good Samaritan Center. On a broader scale, a coalition of San Antonio businesses, church leaders, and community activists held a gang summit last spring to try to get warring gang leaders to lay down their arms. It had only limited success. 4 gang leaders from the West Side signed a peace pact, but they already got along, and the East Side gangs shunned the summit altogether. The Good Samaritan Center serves as a neutral ground where gang members can get assistance with court cases and probation officers, tutoring, and even a job. These kids have closed off so many options, says Hernandez, 63. When you have shot somebody, you have restricted yourself to staying with your gang in the area where they are strong. When these kids try to venture out somewhere on a city bus, they have to work out elaborate routes so they can stay out of another gang's turf in order to stay alive. Police say violence in the area has decreased considerably over the past few months. We have appealed to the leaders, who are extremely intelligent, says Hernandez. They are the surrogate parents for the gang members. They provide food and shelter. They protect them. A lot of gang members don't live with their own families anymore in order to protect them from drive-bys. We show the leaders that there are alternatives to killing each other, Hernandez says. We take them out of a crowd where they feel they have to prove how tough they are and show them another way. Gang members who end up serving time in jail as adults often graduate to the toughest gang of all, the Mexican Mafia, or LAIM, a prison-based gang that controls drug sales in San Antonio. Joining the Mexican Mafia is equivalent to playing in the major leagues. Drive-bys become planned executions, and drug sales and racketeering replace auto theft and vandalism. Members are recruited in prison. Young street gang members taking their first trip to the penitentiary often choose the hardcore gang lifestyle of the Mafia for the protection it offers in jail. Usually, though, kids involved with gangs quit long before there is any temptation to join the Mafia. The fast life is not as alluring when they have children of their own to support. In May, Markey said he planned to quit gangs altogether. At middle school, they had some counselors go over there and tell you what lie is and what jobs are good, he said. They talked about being a paramedic. That's what I want to be. I know how a bullet is and how it comes out. I've seen a lot of blood. Since then, Markey has indeed quit Damage, he says, after falling out with its leader. There are success stories of kids who have turned their lives around and left their days of drive-by shootings and stealing behind. In August, the talk at the Alazan courts was of a gang member who had joined the Marines. Jimmy Ibarra still fondly remembers the day a year ago when a lot of the Kings, one of the biggest gangs on the west side, dropped their colors forever. They just up and quit, he says. They said, "We are sick of it and we won't do it anymore." Many of the IDs who are involved with gangs do not fit the profile of thuggish troublemakers who don't have the brains or patience to make it in school. They can be the bright, popular kids or members of the football team. One 18-year-old former Kings member says he was an honor student and a junior varsity football and basketball player at Taffola Middle School when he joined the gang his childhood friends belonged to. His life changed for the worse. "I got kicked out of school for fighting, and they sent me to Jefferson High School. Then they kicked me out over there because they thought I was the leader of the Kings there," he says. "Every day in high school we skipped school, watched a movie, and got stoned. Now I realize I messed up. All the Kings stopped because we got kids now," he says. "I don't want to be a bum. It's like a cycle. We get older and we grow out of it, but then our little brothers and cousins grow into it. I wish it were over, you know? It's not worth it." On a sunny afternoon, Ibarra watches the kids playing basketball at the Alazan Apache courts. As he lights a cigarette, he notices one 15-year-old get in the face of another and punch him in the head 3 times. Ibarra jogs over to break up the fight and learns that the kid who was taking the punches had been accused by 2 7-year-old boys of touching their crotches while playing. The youth meting out the punishment is an uncle of one of the little boys and an MD gang member. The wounded teenager walks off the court without a word, and the play continues. Ibarra looks on as gang members share the basketball with younger kids, making layups and fighting for rebounds. He watches the ND grab the ball and shoot. The little boys also watch him and move closer, mimicking his style. Case 2. Margaret Raley, the 38-year-old wife of the Reverend Walker Raley of Dallas, was found beaten, choked, and unconscious on the floor of their garage when her husband returned from studying at the library shortly after midnight on April 22, 1987. The police had no leads in the case. Dr. Raley, who is white, has been an outspoken critic of racial prejudice in this city, said the Times. According to the executive minister in Raley's church, Gordon D. Cassad, Raley had received a series of threatening letters in the preceding weeks and had preached his Easter sermon wearing a bulletproof vest. It took a moment for the realization to sink in that this bizarre episode had taken place in my very own church, the First United Methodist Church, on the corner of Ross and Harwood in downtown Dallas. This was the church I grew up in and angrily ran away from and retreated to on several guilty occasions. What I always had hated about my church was its instinctive fear of confronting society. But here was a minister who had spoken out against racial injustice and inequality in a city where such things are rarely said aloud. Here was a man threatened with death in that same sanctuary. And here was a man whose wife was strangled into what the doctors called a persistent vegetative state, for no other obvious reason than that someone wanted to punish Walker Raley for preaching the truth. Was this Dallas? I asked myself. The open savagery of the Raley tragedy seemed oddly wrong in a city that is deeply preoccupied with appearances. From the beginning there was about the story a vague but haunting discordance. And yet I was willing to believe that perhaps Dallas had returned to the racial violence of the 50s. Apparently Dallas worried about that too. For the next week the city was on its knees in prayer services and editorial self-reproach. It was a moment when people of various faiths and races stopped to pray for Walker and Peggy Raley and their 2 young children, Ryan and Megan. "Fight on, Raley family," cried the Reverend Darrell Coleman of the Kirkwood CME Temple Church in a rare gathering of the races at Thanksgiving Square. "Fight on, soldiers of righteousness and truth. Thank God for today." The Baptists issued a statement that the fact that a minister's clear stand against racial injustice and bigotry would jeopardize his life is an indicting commentary on our society. Rabbi Sheldon Zimmerman of Temple Emmanuel concluded that the Raley family had been singled out because of his almost prophetic stance in regard to injustice in any form. As Peggy lay in intensive care, hundreds of visitors came day after day to Presbyterian Hospital to pay homage to a woman few people knew well. The traffic was so great that volunteers from the church came to assist. Peggy's condition, at first critical, settled into an awful stasis. She was neither dead nor alive. It was as if she were waiting for some momentous resolution before she could either die or be released back into life. And as for her husband, his tragedy seemed unbearable. He had been the rising star of Methodism, as some called him, an electrifying preacher who had awakened the slumbering old church and infused it with his own extraordinary vigor. Now he was crushed by some unknown force too vast and heartless to be fended off by faith alone. On the Sunday after the attack, the congregation of First Church returned to the sanctuary in a state of shock. There was an obvious show of security police, which added to the air of continuing menace. From the pulpit, Qassad read a message from Rayleigh, who remained in the hospital to be near his wife. I do not know why senseless violence continues to pervade society, nor do I understand why the events of this past week took place, Rayleigh's message said. You have proven to me and all of Dallas that our church is a family. I have been reminded once again that the breath of life is fragile, but the fabric of life is eternal. Peggy was neither dead nor alive. It was as if she were waiting for some momentous resolution before she could either die or be released back into life. It is worth pausing to wonder at a city where a crime might assume such metaphorical power. When I was a child in the First Church, our minister, Robert E. Goodrich, Jr., used to speak about the climate of the city. It was one of his favorite sermons, one he turned to on that Sunday after John Kennedy came to town and became the 111th homicide of 1963. There's no question about a relationship between physical climate and life. How about the spiritual and cultural climate of a neighborhood, a city, a home? In this elusive fashion, Goodrich would imply that Dallas was not innocent of Kennedy's murder. There was something about the climate of the city that generated tragedy, that caused lightning to strike. Dallas is a city distinguished by clean, quiet, well-ordered suburbs. It is a pious town, with more than 1,200 churches and the highest-paid preachers in America. Many of the largest Protestant congregations in the world are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, including 7 of the top 20 churches in United Methodism. But all this piety and bustle hides another Dallas. It is number 1 among large American cities in the rate of overall crime. It has the highest rate of divorce. Dear Abby surveyed her readers last summer and concluded that Dallas, Fort Worth has more unfaithful spouses than any other region. 1 out of every 6 murders in Texas occurs in Dallas County. These grim figures describe the climate of the city today. Nevertheless, I felt hope and pride in a city that was painfully examining itself. It seemed to me that it was the special destiny of Dallas to have to grow through tragedy. These were my thoughts until 9 days after the attack. Then Rayleigh locked himself in his hospital suite and ingested 3 bottles of tranquilizers and antidepressants, leaving a lengthy suicide note that said demons had been inside him for years and he was tired of trying to be good. By the time police broke in the following morning, he too had fallen into a coma. The focus of suspicion shifted from Dallas to Walker Rayleigh himself. Civic introspection abruptly stopped. If Rayleigh were guilty, then Dallas must be innocent. But I wasn't so sure. It seemed to me that the Rayleigh case went to the essence of Dallas, because it was a case of contrasting appearances. Who was Walker Rayleigh, a holy, martyred minister or a depraved and perhaps insane villain? Although First Church is not even the largest Methodist church in Dallas, it has a reputation of being the mother church of Methodism. 8 men who stood in this pulpit before Rayleigh went on to become bishops. Indeed, Rayleigh's own election to the episcopacy was regarded as a certainty, perhaps as early as 1988, when he would have become one of the youngest bishops in the history of Methodism. Even his appointment as senior pastor of First Church in 1980 at the age of 33 was an astonishment, according to eminent Methodist theologian Albert Outler. He leapfrogged over 24 of his elders who thought they were his equal. For 10 years First Church had been losing members, as had many downtown churches all across the country, as had Methodism itself. He breathed life into this church from his first sermon, when he literally blew into the microphone, remembers the choir director, John Yarrington, who became Rayleigh's dear friend. Membership quickly increased, as did the budget, which more than doubled over the 7 years that Rayleigh held the pulpit. New people came to First Church because they adored Walker Rayleigh. I've heard Harry Emerson Fosdick, Ralph Sockman, Ernest Fremont Tittle, and Norman Vincent Peale, says G.W. French, a lay leader in the church, and I still feel that Walker Rayleigh was the greatest pulpiteer I ever heard. For some of the older members, the personality cult they saw evolving around Rayleigh took their breath away. Rayleigh was a vigorous, outspoken advocate of certain social issues endorsed by the yuppie element, which had begun to make up a new, younger core of the congregation. He opposed capital punishment, supported equal rights for women and minorities, declared his ambivalence on the subject of abortion, and defended the rights of homosexuals. He preached an open letter to President Reagan, calling for increased arms control. All of those stands, in the context of Dallas, seemed rather brave, although it is also true that many Methodist ministers in town had preached similar sermons, and Raleigh's social liberalism was pretty much what United Methodism had come to. Personal behavior, that is to say morality and ethics, was rarely mentioned. Rayleigh often inveighed against the disparity of great wealth and great deprivation that characterized the city, but he himself had grown comfortable with his $100,000 annual salary, his luxurious Lake Highlands home, and the many perks, favors, loans, and subsidies that came from being a high-steeple preacher in a wealthy Protestant congregation. For a young man who had grown up in the little western Kentucky farming community of Owensboro, the son of a sheet metal worker, it had been quite a climb. To a certain extent, he was an existential man, observes Dallas City Councilman Craig Holcomb, one of those who had been drawn to Raleigh's ministry. He worked very hard and created who Walker Raleigh was going to be. Because of the importance of First Church within the denomination, many of the congregation are ordained ministers who are retired or working in other areas of the ministry. Among that group, Raleigh was a polarizing figure. The Reverend Howard Grimes, who taught Christian education at SMU's Perkins School of Theology for 33 years, calls Raleigh one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Protestant preacher in the latter half of the 20th century. He had become God for a lot of people, and maybe me. The younger clergymen in the congregation, Raleigh's contemporaries, tended to look at him with less awe and with more than a little resentment. His popularity at First Church was such for many people that they lost all sense that he had any imperfection, says Reverend Spurgeon Dunham III, the editor of the United Methodist Reporter. Dunham and Raleigh had jostled for power in the corporation that is buried inside the denomination. The politics of the church are so subtle that only the most astute and discerning could understand what was going on. Walker was very analytical and perceptive. He took to that process very early. In the course of numerous different meetings, it became clear to me his primary agenda was to be elected to the episcopacy as soon as possible. He campaigned for it by accepting speaking engagements here, there, and everywhere. He seemed incapable of saying no to serving additional outside responsibilities. His ambition was so completely unchecked. Within a few years of his arrival at First Church, Raleigh had become one of the most prominent churchmen in town, rivaling even W. A. Criswell at the immense First Baptist Church a block away. In the past, whenever something religious would come up, the press would ask Dr. Criswell what he thought of it. Pretty soon they stopped that and started asking Walker Raleigh, says the Reverend John Holbert, who taught Raleigh Hebrew at SMU and who sings in the choir at First Church. Raleigh served as president of the Greater Dallas Community of Churches. He was on the United Methodists National Board of Global Ministries. He was selected to preach Protestant Hour sermons on a nationwide Christian radio network. Already his name was widely known among Methodists as a man destined not just for the bishop's chair, but for something more, for greatness, in whatever form that might assume. And yet there were extraordinary pressures that were at work and were already evident in Raleigh's personality. Several times he told Gordon Cassad that the congregation at First Church could never forgive even one bad sermon. So he slaved over his lessons, polished his delivery, choreographed his gestures, until each one of them was a characteristic Raleigh gem. Once, in the receiving line after the 11 o'clock service, a seminary student asked what it took to preach a sermon like the one he had just heard, and Raleigh answered candidly, about 35 hours. In a church with a congregation of nearly 6,000 members and a $2 million budget, a pastor spends a considerable amount of time visiting hospitals, preaching funerals, counseling troubled youngsters, running administrative meetings, setting budget goals. It's a demanding occupation. Raleigh had a staff of 65 people to assist him, but just keeping the staff appeased was a full-time job. He was the kind of preacher who knew everybody's name, says Diane Yarrington, John Yarrington's wife and Peggy Raleigh's closest friend. He wrote hundreds of personal notes to people all the time. On your birthday, you'd always get a handwritten note from Walker. He would make a special trip to a high school to see a play that one of the Sunday school children might be in. He spent hours and hours a day doing that kind of thing. And of course it wore him down. Rayleigh found in the church the loving family he himself had never known as the child of alcoholic and often neglectful parents. John Yarrington became the older brother I never had. Howard Grimes was a real father to me. Mrs. Knox Oaksley was my Dallas mother. It was typical of Rayleigh to seek out such ersatz family members. He wanted to be loved and esteemed. He also wanted to return to his congregation the steady, attentive care he had craved as a young boy. By pouring that kind of love on the thousands before him, it was as if he were ministering to the angry and neglected child inside himself. He would not let them down, as he had been let down. When in times of grief or trouble, a parishioner would stumble or his faith would fail, Reverend Rayleigh was there, strong, certain, and unwavering. His faith was a compass point by which others in the church could steer their fragile beliefs. In these ways Walker Rayleigh became something larger than himself, and subtly, something other than himself. Because behind the public face of this caring, highly blessed young man, with his beautiful wife, his charming children, his prestigious job, his important future, there was another Walker Rayleigh. This was a man so besieged by the doubts and worries he held aside during the day that he seldom enjoyed an untroubled night's sleep. This was a person seen only occasionally by people close to him, his staff, for instance, who idolized him and were sometimes crushed by a volcanic temper that slept and slept then suddenly savagely erupted, usually over some small point such as the lighting in the sanctuary or the presentation of the budget. Nor were these eruptions followed by periods of remorse, which would have made them easy to forgive. Instead, a certain cool satisfaction took hold of him. He would not call back the rain of shattering insults that led to tears or angry resignations. In the recent past, when this other defiant, uncaring, self-centered Walker Rayleigh had gained ascendancy, friends had talked him into seeing a psychiatrist to help him cope with stress. Lately, however, when many of those closest to him had suggested that he go back to the psychiatrist, that he slow down, that he take a sabbatical, he had coldly cut them off. When word of another Rayleigh outburst circulated among the congregation, it was usually seen as more evidence of his temperamental genius. How insidious that must have seemed to him. Whatever fault he confessed to, whatever awful behavior he committed, only brought him new credit. Or perhaps, and this is the worst thing that can happen to a preacher, it is where he crosses the line between serving the forces of good and serving those of evil. Perhaps he had begun to believe in his own perfection. Some of the other ministers in the congregation suspected that Rayleigh had become one of those preachers who see themselves as God's special messengers, one of those who become so convinced that they are so holy that they are above the standards they have to preach. As Spurgeon Dunham observes, the sin is to become as God, as one who would take God's place. Anytime a human being reaches that level, he sets himself up for a fall. On Easter Sunday, 3 days before the attack on Peggy, Walker Rayleigh preached what would be his last sermon. In the days to come, it would be reinterpreted in ways that no one in the congregation that morning could have imagined. On this holy day, which is set aside for hope, love, and rejoicing, the cast of characters who would figure in the tragedy were all in place in the sanctuary, about to begin a weird and, one could believe, demonic journey into a world of passion, violence, and madness. Just before the 11 o'clock service, the seventh of a series of threatening letters addressed to Rayleigh was slipped under Gordon Cassade's office door. "Easter is when Christ arose, but you are going down," the note said. There was already a police guard in the church, but the possibility that the author of those threats had walked unnoticed into the church offices left the staff and the police unnerved. They were even more surprised when an associate pastor, acting on a hunch, ran upstairs and typed out the same message on an IBM Selectric on the 3rd floor. The typeface appeared to be the same. Whoever was sending the notes was probably a member of the congregation, perhaps even a member of the staff. Rayleigh, a medium-sized, balding man with intense blue eyes, was pale and thin-lipped but apparently determined to preach. He borrowed an ill-fitting bulletproof vest from a woman police officer and strapped it on like a corset beneath his Easter vestments. Few people in the congregation knew about the threats, but most sensed that something was wrong as soon as they entered the sanctuary. Councilman Holcomb noticed that Rayleigh did not enter the procession behind the choir as he usually did. Instead, the choir came in alone, and the pastoral staff entered through a side door, without Rayleigh. "I kept noticing these men standing beside the doors," Holcomb recalls. "I kept thinking I knew these men, but they're not from the church." Later he recognized investigator Steve Torres as one of the officers who guard the city council. The congregation rose to sing the doxology, and when they sat down, Rayleigh abruptly appeared in the pulpit. Looking out from the pulpit, He saw 3,000 parishioners in their Easter finery, filling the sanctuary and spilling out into the hallway, where uniformed policemen had just arrived to guard the exits. It was no longer the predominantly elderly congregation that had greeted him on his first sermon in this pulpit 7 years before. Who could deny that Walker Raleigh had put his stamp on this church and invigorated it with the force of his personality? And yet hovering over the sanctuary was a ghost that haunted Raleigh and would never let him feel entirely at home here. It was the ghost of Robert Goodrich. All the things Raleigh wanted, all the honors he sought, Goodrich had achieved. Goodrich had been elected bishop in 1972 and was succeeded in the first church pulpit by Ben Oliphant, who also became a bishop 8 years later. It was Goodrich with whom Raleigh was compared, however, and not always favorably. In many ways, I'll always consider that piece of wood up in front of the sanctuary as Bob Goodrich's pulpit, Raleigh would admit. Perhaps it was an act of charity, or perhaps it was cleverness on Raleigh's part that he brought Bishop Goodrich back to Dallas in his final years of life, when he was ill and doddering, and placed him once again on the staff of his old church, where everyone could compare the old frail man with his lively young successor. In the congregation on Easter morning was Bishop Goodrich's elegant widow, Thelma. I should note that she and her husband were close friends of my parents, and that she is a woman whose dignity I have always admired. Thelma was sitting with Lucy, the second of her 4 children. Despite the mascara and frosted hair, one look at Lucy, and you could see she was Bob Goodrich's daughter. She had that knotted Goodrich chin, his thin, drawn smile, and the dark eyes that were his most distinctive feature. Eyes that seemed remote, but also searching and intelligent. It was a strong face, like her father's, and if in some lights it appeared hard, in others you could detect a vulnerable and even wounded soul who had lived past the point where life surprised her. When she was younger, Lucy played the piano in the Sunday school class that my father taught. Now Lucy was 45 with 2 teenage children, but she was still slim and youthful, with the athletic carriage that was also a Goodrich legacy. She had been through 2 marriages before going off to California and becoming a clinical psychologist. She had come home to Dallas to set up a practice specializing in eating disorders. Along the way, she acquired a new last name, one of her own invention, Papillon, which means butterfly in French. Dr. Papillon once explained the metaphor of the butterfly to Reverend Raleigh when he interviewed her on Faith Focus, his weekly television show. The caterpillars crawling around feels like the world's okay, but if they really want to fly, they've got to go through the darkest thing they've ever seen, which is the cocoon. According to the local press, soon after Lucy Papillon returned to Dallas, she became Walker Raleigh's mistress. Mrs. Walker Raleigh sat in a pew halfway back, next to a woman police officer who happened to be a member of the church. It had become unusual to see Peggy in the congregation. Over the last year she had withdrawn from the choir and the children's Sunday school class that she taught, then from the board suppers and picnics and retreats, and finally from the main Sunday service. Walker explained her absence as illness or a need to be closer to 5-year-old Ryan and 2-year-old Megan. Although it was true that Peggy had suffered a bout of walking pneumonia earlier in 1987, she had recovered from that, and as for the children, other mothers in the congregation wondered why she couldn't leave them in the nursery as they did. Peggy, however, always had seemed a remote personality, as introverted, friends said, as Walker was extroverted, so her retreat from church society was only partly noticed. She was certainly much less visible than any other pastor's wife I've ever seen, says a member of the pastoral staff. Later, while she lay in the hospital, fighting for the marginal edge of life that had been left her, people would describe Peggy as cool and distant, but to those few who she had allowed to know her well, she was a warm and devoted friend. The pictures that would appear in the newspaper did her no justice, because Peggy Raleigh was quite a beautiful woman. Where Lucy was strong and stylish, Peggy was frail and demure, but with a natural attractiveness much like a fresh-faced milkmaid of her native Wisconsin. Peggy had a lovely singing voice. She was second soprano, although her true talents were in her fingers. She had studied organ at SMU, obtaining a master's degree, and she might have pursued a career as a professional musician if she hadn't chosen to give herself over to the humbler role of being a minister's wife. In March, after she had recovered from her illness, she succumbed to friends' urgings and gave a small lunchtime harpsichord recital at the church, with John Yarrington joining her at the end of the program to sing a Bach cantata. She appeared wan, and there was a new hollowness about her cheeks, but in many respects she had never been more lovely. And yet what was most striking about this performance was Peggy's trance-like behavior. She played robotically, and when the audience applauded her, she gave a sudden startled smile. Where was she? She seemed to be in some faraway sad place. Later people would remember that performance and wonder if Peggy had known about Lucy. Another of Peggy's talents was sewing. She had made many of the elegant seasonal stoles that the ministers wore over their robes. Walker was wearing one now, a white stole with the Greek letters Alpha and Omega appliqued on either side. Beneath the stole was Walker's black robe, and under the robe was his suit jacket, and under the jacket was the bulletproof vest. So as Walker stood in the pulpit, his first action was to mop his bulbous forehead with a handkerchief. He began his sermon with a discussion of a book written in 1965 called The Passover Plot. The premise of the book was that the crucifixion had been faked. Of course, Rayleigh went on to dismiss the Passover Plot. If there's ever a day you have nothing of substance to do, and you want nothing of substance to read, it would be a fine book to peruse. Perhaps he was only using the book as a provocative introduction to the standard Easter rejoicing. The questions that he was posing about Jesus, however, were exactly the same ones that would later be asked of him. Was he truly a martyr? The man who was now standing in Bob Goodrich's pulpit in a bulletproof vest. The man whose life for the next 2 weeks would be a march of catastrophe, from the attack on Peggy, followed by Walker's evasive testimony to the police, and culminating in his attempted suicide? Or was he orchestrating his own martyrdom, creating a myth of himself that would raise him higher and make the drama of his own small life into something grander, something divine? Some of his fellow ministers suspected that Rayleigh had set himself up for a fall by placing himself above the standards he preached. Photo illustration by Jeff Kern, model courtesy of Peggy Taylor Incorporated. One could scarcely call me an objective reporter. From the moment I got into the story, I had trouble holding on to my neutrality. I bullied my way into an interview with Rayleigh's bishop, who said I was beneath contempt. I told preachers who refused to speak to me about the case that they were sanctimonious hypocrites. I excoriated the staff of First Church for not confronting the evil that had taken place in their own sanctuary. My behavior was hard to excuse and hard to explain. In part it was anger at Dallas, a city where pious public faces often hid secret dirty appetites. But Dallas was an old war of mine, one that I had grown tired of fighting, to the point that I had subsided into an exhausted peace on the matter. The truth was that, like any old contestant, I had begun to sentimentalize the battles of my youth, and had become grateful to Dallas for helping me learn who I am. More than Dallas, there was Methodism. I have seen friends struggle to throw off the narrow-minded strictures of Southern Baptism, or the ritualistic magic of Catholicism, or the tribal creeds of Judaism. I have encountered religion in extreme forms, from Hare Krishnas and Amish farmers to snake-handling charismatics. And yet, with all my ambivalence about religion, what I feel about people who believe or disbelieve such stringent doctrines is a low-grade envy. For at least a hard-shell Baptist has the literalism of the Bible to react against. A Catholic has the pomp and mystery of the liturgy, and so on, but a Methodist struggles in a fog, not really knowing what is to be believed or disbelieved, but learning in a subliminal way what is to be avoided. I could not fairly hold Methodism responsible for the values of this city, because despite the fact that Dallas is a stronghold of United Methodism, only 7% of the population belongs to the denomination, a figure that represents less than half the number of Southern Baptists and is even behind the Catholics. This fact doesn't alter my opinion that Methodism is the state religion of corporate America, of which Dallas is the purest and most fervent example. Methodism began in the slums of 18th century London and the British coalfields, where John Wesley began his ministry to the underclass. It settled the American frontier in the form of the lonely, tireless circuit rider, and thus it took root in an ambitious, desperately poor frontier people, and it grew with them as their cities grew, as their generations prospered, and as their politics and values changed. So had the church grown and prospered and changed, becoming essentially the same institution its founder had rebelled against. Yes, I was angry at Methodism because I thought it had turned into nothingism and was only in business to stay in business. My particular quarrel with Methodism began here in First Church, however, where for so much of my adolescence I had felt confused and bewildered and overlooked. It had seemed to me then that the special quality of my church was to float above the real world of lust and violence, passion and broken hearts, in a higher atmosphere of untroubled Christian behavior. Human failings were seldom addressed. I recall when the assistant pastor left his family and ran off to Colorado with a ski instructor. His name was never mentioned again. All that remained of him was some intoxicating vapor of sin and forbidden desire, an intimation of another world I was not supposed to know about. The church was like a timid old woman hiding behind shutters, shielding herself from confusion. I had seen Walker Raleigh preach on Christmas Eve, 1984, when I was back in Dallas to see my parents. It was a tormented moment for me, a time when I had been confounded by my own behavior and eager to seek forgiveness. In that raw condition, I experienced what so many would later speak of, the sensation that Raleigh was preaching to me, that those large and expressive blue eyes that swept across the sanctuary like a searchlight were looking for me. Now, after the attack on Peggy Raleigh, I had come back inside the old sanctuary, had listened to another sermon that refused to acknowledge what had happened within the church's own family. Week after week had passed with one revelation after another, and only the most oblique references from the pulpit about what was transpiring in the world beyond the stained glass windows. Nothing was said of Raleigh's attempted suicide. Nothing was said of the sensational revelations of Lucy Papillon's grand jury testimony, in which she talked about their affair, which had gone on for more than a year, their marriage plans, and their assignations while he was out preaching. They had even arranged to meet in England when Raleigh returned from a World Methodist Council meeting in Nairobi. Nothing was said of Raleigh's refusal to cooperate with the police or his decision to plead the Fifth Amendment before the grand jury. The church was in a state of delirium. "We're fine, the church is fine, everything's going to be fine," a member of the board assured me. I fought an impulse to stand up and shout Walker Raleigh's name out loud. On the night of April 21st, 1987, at 6:30 in the evening, Raleigh drove into the family garage. He says he found his wife working on a garage door latch with a bar of soap. The spring on the latch had been sticking, and Peggy was trying to lubricate it. According to Raleigh, he sat on the hood of Peggy's Chrysler for a few minutes, talking to his wife. She and the children already had eaten dinner, and Walker wasn't hungry, so the two of them shared a glass of wine. He then left, still in his business suit, ostensibly to spend the evening at the SMU libraries to write footnotes for his book on preaching. At 6:38, Raleigh called the time from his car phone. Everyone knew that Raleigh did not wear a watch. He had given it up when he came to First Church, partially because of his habit of wearing French cuffs, which frayed when he kept pushing up his sleeve to check the time. The phone had just been installed that day, at church expense. It was another of the many security measures the church provided him, including a home alarm system and a separate private telephone line. Raleigh says he spent the next 30 minutes at Bridwell Library at the theology school, searching for a biography of Anne Sullivan, Helen Keller's teacher. At 7:26 he was back in his car, calling Janet Marshall, a family friend who was going to babysit for the Raleigh children while Walker and Peggy went to San Antonio for the weekend. At 7:32 he called Lucy Papillon, then drove to her house, where he stayed for about 40 minutes. He says he went there to get some relaxation tapes to help relieve his stress. A librarian at Bridwell remembers seeing Raleigh sometime after 8, when the minister asked what time the library closed. At 8:30 Raleigh called Peggy from a pay phone, and she told him she was putting the children to bed. After that, Peggy talked to her parents in Tyler until 9:14. Meanwhile, Raleigh had left the library. He purchased gas at a Texaco station on Greenville Avenue at 8:53 and also bought a wine cooler, which he says accounts for the fact that police would later report him as intoxicated when they came to his house 4 hours later. At 9:30 a.m. Jogger saw a man in a business suit running through a yard 2 streets away from the Raleigh's house. Between 10:15 and 10:30 a.m. neighbor heard rustling noises in the alley behind the Raleigh's house. Raleigh says he had gone to the Texaco station because he was thirsty and had returned to his research in the main library. The police say they have indisputable evidence that he was lying about his whereabouts from the time he left the Texaco station until a librarian saw him sometime between 11 and midnight. At midnight, Raleigh attempted to give his business card to a Nigerian student at the checkout desk. On the back of the card was a message to the research librarian, asking for help in finding the Sullivan biography. He had also written the time, which was noted to be 10:30. After leaving the library, Raleigh phoned his home from his car, but this time he called the listed line, which was connected to an answering machine and did not even ring in the house. "I don't have my watch on," said the man who never wore one, "but it's about 10:30 or 10:45. Telephone company records show that the call was actually made at 3 minutes after midnight. If you want to, go ahead and lock the garage door, and I'll park out front." At 12:29, he called his answering machine again, giving the correct time and saying he was on his way home. The theory of Rayleigh's guilt presumes that Peggy was strangled sometime around 10:30, and that the calls were meant to establish both an alibi for himself and a reason for Peggy to go to the garage. 11 minutes after the second call, Rayleigh drove into the driveway and found the garage door partly open. The garage was dark. Mysteriously, the bulbs had been removed from the overhead light of the automatic door opener. Rayleigh said he left his headlights on and got out of the car. He found Peggy lying behind her Chrysler, writhing in convulsions. Her face was hugely swollen and discolored, yet her hair was scarcely mussed and her glasses were in place. At 12:43 a.m., police dispatcher received a call from Rayleigh who said, I just came into the house and my wife is in the garage. Somebody has done something to her. The dispatcher inquired, has she been beat up or what? I don't know, Rayleigh replied. She's foaming at the mouth or something. The phone rang about 12:45, says Diane Yarrington. It was Walker. He said, Diane, something awful has happened to Peggy. Come quick, come right now. We literally raced over there. By the time we got there, the ambulance had arrived. Walker was inside holding Megan. Ryan was sort of sitting on the couch. I talked with Walker briefly, and then I said, I'll take the children, and I asked the kids what they wanted to take with them. They each grabbed a pillow and a stuffed animal. Walker said, don't leave me. And John said, I'll be here. I'm like your second skin. John Yarrington accompanied Walker to the hospital, and after he had gotten his friend settled, he went to speak to the doctors. I did not know what had happened. I knew she had been hurt, but I didn't know how, he says. At that point, the doctor's assessment was that Peggy's neck had been broken, and I asked how would that happen. Well, she was strangled. That was the first I knew. John went into the emergency room where Peggy lay. It's a terrible thing to see. It's technicolor in my brain. I'll never forget her lying on that table, with that blotchy color, a terrible thing to see on someone you love. For most of the 7 years the Yarringtons had known the Rayleighs, they had been the closest of friends. Diane and Peggy were like sisters. They spoke several times a day on the phone and sat next to each other in the choir. Peggy accompanied John's rehearsals every Sunday night. Walker had been John's boss and also his spiritual guide and soulmate. Several months before the attack on Peggy, the couples had pledged that if anything were to happen, if one of the couples were to die in a plane accident or some other tragedy would befall them, then the other couple would take care of their children. John had made the pledge in all sincerity, but who could believe that so suddenly and so grotesquely it would come due? The next day, Rayleigh went to the police station with a lawyer friend to talk to investigative officer Rick Silva. It is the only time Rayleigh has talked to the police. His story then was that he had come home, spoken briefly to Peggy while she was working on the garage door latch, then spent the rest of the evening in the libraries. He said he had no idea who might want to harm her, except for the author of the anonymous letters. Silva indicated that he would like to set up a polygraph examination, and Rayleigh said he would be happy to cooperate. During the next week, the police learned about the telephone call to Lucy. They listened to the tape on Rayleigh's answering machine. They discovered a credit card slip from the Texaco station, and they examined the garage door, which seemed to work fine. They found no evidence that the latch had been lubricated. In fact, they learned that the Rayleighs had complained to the manufacturer and had had a new automatic door opener installed only a few days earlier. In the meantime, Rayleigh stayed in his hospital suite, meeting friends and going through the mail. Lucy came to visit him, carrying a single red rose. One day he received telegrams from both Jesse Jackson and Billy Graham, and he went in to tell Peggy she had made ecclesiastical history. She looked at him with open, unseeing eyes. Her brain was damaged but not dead. What she comprehended no one could even guess. Friends played videos of her harpsichord concert and papered her room with pictures drawn by Ryan and Megan. There was some hope, in those early days, that something inside Peggy would stir to life. Peggy, it's Diane. Peggy's face was still puffy and discolored the first morning Diane Yarrington got to see her. The children are with me. It's just fine. It's all right. A tear rolled out of Peggy's eye. Later others would see her crying. Walker did, even Detective Silva, and they would wonder what she knew or felt. The truth was locked inside Peggy and could never be expressed, but that did not mean that it couldn't be experienced. What an unendurable tragedy that would be, to be alone with the truth. The inconsistencies and omissions in Rayleigh's story had accumulated to the point that Silva telephoned the hospital and told the officers guarding Rayleigh's room that he wanted to question Rayleigh. When they went to his room, they found the door locked. They broke in and found Rayleigh's unconscious body and his suicide note. Once again, John Yarrington would be standing in the same emergency room, this time over Walker's body as doctors pumped the drugs out of his stomach. Fortunately, Walker had not taken all the pills that were on his bedside table. Like Peggy, he had fallen onto that ledge of deep unconsciousness between life and death. Unlike her, he had not suffered a loss of oxygen and glucose to the brain, which doctors said probably would prevent her from recovering. She was wrapped in a cocoon from which few ever emerge. For the next 5 days, Walker lay in intensive care in a room opposite Peggy's. It was bizarre and weird, says John. You would go to your left to see Walker and go to your right to see Peggy. They essentially looked much the same. On the Wednesday after the Friday he had attempted suicide, Rayleigh awakened, and the first thing he remembers is seeing his friend standing vigil at his bedside. He had absolutely no recall of anything. It was 2 more days before he fully resurfaced. Rayleigh asked John then whether he could regain the pulpit. John was startled by the question. I think it's very iffy, he said. Walker seemed surprised and wanted to know why. Well, number 1, you tried to commit suicide. And number 2, a lot of people think you strangled Peggy. The police had enough evidence to disbelieve Walker Rayleigh, but not enough to charge him. After he got out of the hospital, Rayleigh checked into Timbalon Psychiatric Center while his attorney, Doug Mulder, arranged for him to take a privately administered polygraph. The test indicated that Rayleigh did not attack his wife and did not know who did. The next day at the police department, Rayleigh took a polygraph which proved inconclusive, although Rayleigh showed deception about the threatening letters. Mulder and Rayleigh arranged for a third polygraph, the results of which they have never made public. Norm Kinney, the frustrated chief criminal prosecutor in the district attorney's office, convened a grand jury investigation and warned Rayleigh in front of television cameras to either come before the grand jury or leave the country, an odd injunction to be directed at the main suspect in the case. Rayleigh appeared and took the Fifth Amendment 43 times. No indictments were handed down, but so much of the testimony was leaked to the press that it appeared that the grand jury was called for no other purpose than a public shaming of Walker Rayleigh. With the justice system at an impasse, a group of Methodist clergymen wrote a letter to Bishop John Russell, asking for a church inquiry into Rayleigh's relationship with Lucy. The bishop began a lengthy private negotiation with Rayleigh. On September 2nd, Rayleigh surrendered his credentials, which voided the church's jurisdiction over him. That meant there would be no embarrassing church trial, but it also meant that Peggy's insurance would lapse after 12 months. In October, Rayleigh signed over guardianship of Peggy to her parents, who had placed Peggy in a Tyler nursing home. Peggy's father says that Rayleigh has visited his wife 3 or 4 times. That's about it. The Rayleigh children continue to live with the Yarringtons. I knew I was going to meet with Walker Rayleigh because periodically he emerged from seclusion to proclaim his innocence to reporters and give his own version of the tragic events. The meetings were highly circumscribed, and when Rayleigh finally answered one of my messages, I agreed to the same conditions. We would not talk about the case, and we would not talk about Lucy. Are you a coffee drinker? Rayleigh asked cheerfully on the phone. He said he would have a pot waiting for me when we met in the morning in his Lake Highlands home. There was no for sale sign in front of the white brick house on Trail Hill Drive, although the house was on the market for $279,000. The sole business that was keeping Walker Rayleigh in Dallas was the need to dispose of his property. He had gone through the police, the grand jury, the bishop, and the local reporters, and there remained only me. Rayleigh opened the door and greeted me. The house was comfortable and spacious, with the sun glinting off the pool in the backyard and making wrinkled shadows on the living room ceiling. Perhaps it was simply the absence of family detritus, toys and books and newspapers, that made the house seem so impersonal. Outside it was warm, but the house was unaccountably chilly, like a mausoleum, as Rayleigh observed while we sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee. He had been monitoring my presence ever since I had arrived in Dallas 2 weeks before. I know that you have a couple of layers of subjectivity that are influencing your writing of this story, one having to do with your opinions about me, and one having to do with your inner quarrels with the institutional church. He told me quite accurately. I realized that we had been stalking each other with a growing sense of recognition and mission. His mission, old and by now habitual, was to get me to believe in the church and in himself. Mine was to tear away the many veils of falsity and hypocrisy and get to the truth, whatever that was. He already knew who I was. But did anyone, even Walker Rayleigh, know who he was? I get depressed, he admitted. I see my psychiatrist twice a week and have been doing that since May, and he helps me look inside myself. He spends his days now reading the Psalms, playing golf occasionally, trying to let my soul and my body get together. A few days before, he had enjoyed kind of a joyous highlight, because he had played golf with former District Attorney Henry Wade. It was a fun time, and I thought he showed personal sensitivity to me. Rayleigh said he was worried about the future, about his prospects for a job. For the first time in my life, at 40, I have no earthly idea what, where, when, how, or anything else. So there's an element of fear. He spoke of his ambition. Most of the reports have written that I was drooling on my tie waiting to become a bishop, but that's not entirely true. Bishops are elected for life, he pointed out, and you can only bless the opening of Sunday school units so many times until you get tired. His secret ambition was to stay at First Church another decade, then take early retirement and go to law school, so he could set up a practice in South Dallas to defend underprivileged minorities. I regarded that statement as gratuitous and unlikely. On the other hand, I never did understand the appeal of being a bishop. I had 3 books coming out in '88, Rayleigh was boasting. I was speaking all over the nation. I had been the Protestant Hour preacher. I'd just finished taping the sermons. Under Rayleigh's tenure, First Church had become one of the real turnaround stories in the nation. Everything that he had been working for was coming to fruition. So, I was beginning to feel that my future was okay, but I was trying to get out of the future and more into the present, maybe for the first time in my life. And now all that's lost to you, I observed. You've resigned from the church, the books have been put on hold, your family has broken apart, and your future is in serious question. You're a man who's suffered tremendous losses. Why do you think this has happened to you? This question had been given to me by psychologists I had consulted, on the premise that Rayleigh might be insane. If he is, he has done enough psychological consultation of his own to dodge the paranoiac response. I've always tried to avoid asking why questions because I don't think why questions get you anywhere, he said, giving me his most defiantly honest stare. If I'm asking any question, it's how I can feel the presence of God's healing power in my life right now, when for the first time in my life, I can't even tell you where I'll be tomorrow. He began to recount the events of Tuesday, April 21st, leading up to the discovery of his wife's attack. I went to the library and started at Bridwell down on the south part of the campus. He was checking footnotes for his book of sermons. When he finished there, he walked up to Fondren, the main library. On the way to Fondren, I stopped by Lucy's house, which is directly behind the campus, for about 40 minutes and back to Fondren after getting a Coke at a Texaco station and filling up the car. Worked at Fondren until a little after midnight, about 12:15 or so. I called Peggy to let her know that I was on the way, and I got home about 12:30. I came into the garage and found her. Until that point, he had told the story in a rapid, shorthand manner, so fast that I completely missed the contradiction between his walking to Fondren and filling up his car with gas. He had said he would not talk about the case, and obviously he wanted to skate past this portion. I thought to myself, here's a man who has avoided the police and the grand jury. I can't let him get by me that easily. The police said you had been drinking that night. Peggy and I had a glass of wine, he said. At what time? 7:15. And I had a wine cooler when I stopped at the Texaco. I thought you said you had a Coke at the Texaco. I said Coke, but that was just a Coke break, a coffee break, he replied. I went up there to get something to drink. I refer to that as getting a Coke. He would not be trapped. He started to talk again about finding Peggy. Come here, I want to show you, he said, with a certain demanding eagerness. I want you to see. We walked into the garage, which was large and empty of cars. Against the back wall were several storage closets. I want you to understand that there's a freezer, there's a refrigerator, and there are toys that the children use, like the tricycle, Rayleigh said, pointing out the clutter of an ordinary suburban family, which lined the side of the garage. In the evening it was not uncommon, 6, 7, or 8 times a night, for one of us to come out here. He showed me the latch he said Peggy was working on early in the evening of her attack. Somehow it had gotten bent. How it got bent, I don't know. Rayleigh's voice, even though it was nearly a whisper, reverberated in the vacancy of the garage. Anyway, when I pulled in, the door was about up to here. He indicated the height of his knee. And Peggy was right here. She would have been just behind her Chrysler, between her tool closet and the door that led into the house. As Rayleigh explained how Peggy's body was oriented. Heels here, head here. I thought what an intimate crime strangulation is, what a gruesome and prolonged dance. I was actually horrified, Rayleigh was saying. I have never seen any such thing, let alone my wife. Her face was purple and bloated, and her body was heaving from the waist up. Those were reflex actions, seizures, I later came to realize. I tried to shake her, tried to get some kind of response. And I couldn't get anything and ran in and checked on the children. Megan was lying down in front of the television. We walked back into the house. The family TV sat beside the picture window that looked out on the pool. The TV was on and muted, and she was on the floor, and my first impression was that she was dead. I picked her up and she said, "Daddy." She had her little fingers in her mouth, and she was okay. She had evidently gotten up, looking for Mommy, and the TV was on, and she laid down in front of the television. Had she found her mother? I asked. I don't think so, but I don't know. We went through the living room to the children's rooms. This is Ryan's room, Rayleigh said. The room was still filled with Ryan's dolls and toys. His bed's been moved over to the Yarringtons, Rayleigh explained. But his bed was here, and he was 3/4 of the way asleep, but kind of in a fog. That was, I remembered, well after midnight, when the children would ordinarily be sound asleep. Perhaps the assailant had thought, as I did, that strangulation is a silent crime, but who knows how Peggy may have fought, what kind of racket she might have made. Did she wake the children? The awfulness of that scene played unhappily in my mind, along with the dreadful suspicion that the person who caused this tragedy was the same polite preacher who was giving me the tour of his home. So anyway, Rayleigh continued, I came in and called the police. I called the Yarringtons, and I went across the yard and got my neighbor, and he came over. He stayed with Peggy. I brought the children into the den, sat them down on the sofa with me, and held them. Both were extremely quiet, because they could obviously pick up on my panic. I was hyperventilating and scared to death. Rayleigh and I went up to his special lair on the second floor. As a writer, I have a particular interest in the places people make for themselves to write in. 2 walls were covered with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. There was an imposing desk of the sort that would belong to a bank vice president, and a more modest work area with a computer. One of Rayleigh's manuscripts sat on the table. Under a dictionary stand was a copy of the plays of Eugene O'Neill. It was a handsome office, but once again I noticed an absence of personal effects. Only 2 items in the room caught my eye. One was an SMU basketball on the window ledge behind Rayleigh's desk. He had bought the house from an SMU coach, it turns out, and had written into the contract that a basketball would come with the house. The other item was a 3-foot-tall doll that resembled Big Bird. Rayleigh said he had bought the doll for Ryan when he was in New York, and he recounted the spectacle of himself walking through the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria with the doll under his arm. I laughed, but it struck me as curious that Rayleigh, not Ryan, had the doll now. Rayleigh sat in his easy chair, and I sat on a couch beside him. Tell me about your relationship with Peggy. Well, we'd been married 16 years. Peggy was a lot quieter than me. We had a respect for one another. We were not the kind of couple that held hands and watched television on the sofa. When we went on vacation, before the children came, and went out on the beach, we'd both take a book and read, and listen to the seagulls and watch the waves. We were married 11 years before we had children, and once the children came, we became more and more committed to parenting. Peggy had a great love for the church, and the impression that she didn't enjoy being the pastor's spouse and stuff I think is unfair to her. She was a private person and didn't talk a lot about the inner parts of herself. I think her best friend on the face of the earth was her mother. I don't know how else to answer. We didn't have a lot of arguments. Did she know about your affair? That never came up. She didn't know. I can only say it never emerged. Did she suspect? Rayleigh took a steadying breath. I have no way of knowing regarding that she suspected at all about anything. I knew I was crossing the line he had drawn. I started to press further, but he cut me off. I've told you I would not talk about Lucy, he said. Do you plan to divorce Peggy? That is not a question I will answer. I observed that because of his stature in the community, both the church, through the bishop, and the city, through the district attorney, had advised Rayleigh to leave town to avoid being an embarrassment to them. I guess you could interpret it like that, he said. They don't really have to ask me to leave. I just feel like I got in a situation, and it's time for me to go. Would Lucy join you? I don't care to answer that. You're going to California? I asked. Friends of his had said that was his plan. No, not necessarily. I'm looking for a place to work, Larry. More than once, Rayleigh asked me for information about my business, which was unsettling to me because I already felt a greater sense of identification with him than I cared to feel. Several times he had even urged me to push harder, to do a better job, the job he might have done on me if our roles had been reversed. We were the same age. In many ways the difference between writing and preaching was not so great, nor really was the difference between belief and disbelief. It was the intensity of the struggle that mattered. The lesson I had drawn from Walker Raleig's life so far was that good and evil are not so far apart either. They were both inside Walker Raleigh, warring for control, as they were in me as well. Whether or not Raleigh was guilty, he had caused me to look in myself and see the lurking dangers of my own personality. "I'm surprised you haven't asked about my suicide attempt," he said, once again presuming on my role. He talked about it and began to cry. I found myself curiously removed. I began to tabulate the times he had cried so far. He had cried when he talked about the death of Bishop Goodrich. What I was aware of, here is the point that he cried, was the death of tradition. He came close to crying when he spoke about having to leave this office we were in, which was dear to him. He had cried when I asked him about his recent return to First Church for a memorial service for his babysitter, Janet Marshall, who had suddenly died of lupus in September. When I walked back into the sanctuary, he had said, "The first thing I saw was the pulpit, and I just kind of stood in the back, really, and at that point kind of lost consciousness of what was going on around me." Later in the day, when we were at lunch, he would cry when he remembered his neglected childhood. I didn't question the genuineness of those responses. These were real losses of his tradition, his comfortable home, his profession, his childhood, and nearly his very life. But they seemed what? Was it fair of me to compare his losses against Peggy's? Against his children's? Why didn't he cry for them? What interested me about his suicide attempt was the note he left behind, in which he had spoken of demons. In First Church there had been much speculation about what Raleigh's demons might have been. Perhaps sex, certainly ambition. This is the usual Methodist metaphorical construction of biblical language. I asked Raleigh what demons meant to him. "Demons," he said, that's just not a word I use a lot. I've talked to you about depression, that's a demon. I've talked to you about a low self-esteem, that's a demon. I've talked to you about a great fear over the uncertainty of the future, that's a demon. And there may be a lot more demons, but my point is that several things I've struggled with would fall under the category of demons. And yet your very fifth sermon was on seeing Satan fall. I reminded him. I wonder what your opinion of Satan is. Is he a figurative creature or a real force? Well, first of all, I preached on seeing Satan fall because that was taken directly out of the text of the scripture. It was a sermon on the church. I do not see Satan as some incarnated presence in life, who's over against God, and therefore the two are in a battle, and we're kind of little pawns in the game. That makes me less responsible for my own actions. I think there is evil in the world, and I think there is goodness in the world, and I think that both the inclinations of good, which would be godliness, and the inclination to evil, which would be satanic, are inside of us. But you don't think that at any point in your life you were controlled by forces that you couldn't? No, I don't, he said abruptly. I think that's a theological and a psychological cop-out. Raleigh turned the conversation back to the church, back to the moment when he had stood in the rear of the sanctuary at Janet Marshall's service. Several years before, when Janet's illness flared up, she had summoned her pastor to her hospital room and demanded to know what he was going to preach when she died. She had him actually write out a sermon and read it to her. Her death became the first occasion that I was not able to do something in an ordained way that I would have done, Raleigh remarked. Instead, he had slipped into the church at the last moment, hoping no one would see him, but knowing that everyone expected him to be there. There were some people who, I can't be sure of this, but there were some people who went out of their way because they didn't know what to say. But there were a whole lot more people who did. They just squeezed, hugged, kissed, slapped me on the back. They could feel my pain, he said, crying again. I wasn't able to conceal it. I wasn't trying to. I think everybody knew that I was there under a great price, just emotionally, to walk into that sanctuary. So there was a great combination of pain, but also a sense of joy that the community was there, and I felt its love. Did you feel a sense of shame? I asked. Raleigh looked at me sharply. He is, of course, alert to insinuation. I felt probably every emotion you could feel. But did you feel ashamed? I felt a great need to be forgiven, if that's what you're talking about. When he said this, it seemed to me as much of a concession as I was likely to get. We were still talking in generalities and metaphors, methodistically, as it were, but I had the feeling that we were nearing the truth, as much as I was likely to see of it. On the other hand, perhaps I was merely twisting his words, finding more meaning than was really there. I felt a great need to be reaccepted, Raleigh offered. As who you really are? This was a leap on my part. As who I really am, he agreed. As someone who never wants to lose being part of the community that the church represents. And having had that experience, do you feel now that if you... Here I searched for another word, but none would come. I'm going to use the word confess to whatever you are not talking about now, that they would forgive you? That's a pretty leading question. It's a hard question to ask. That really, that I wish you would ask it another way, Rayleigh said, because I'm not going to answer it like that. It's too much of a setup. I tried to think of another way to ask, but he cut me off. Let me just make a statement, he said. I was aware that night of the love that permeated the sanctuary, God's love, in their lives. God's love is both a judging love and a forgiving love. It's both a healing and a haunting love. And I experienced God's love in all 4 ways that night. Okay, and I think that's about the way I would say it. Before I left, Rayleigh wanted to know what I thought of him. I don't know what your impression is, and you don't have to give it to me, but I've been real honest with you today, he said. I admitted that I found myself relating to him, but I also said that I could not construct an innocent man out of his behavior. I recounted his misleading testimony to the police, his avoidance of the grand jury, his inexplicable actions on the night of Peggy's attack, and so on. I think you're a guilty person, I said. I hear what you're saying, he said. Here he was, reflecting my feelings, while I was accusing him of trying to murder his wife. I didn't know what to think. I appreciate your even responding to that, Rayleigh continued. I'm aware that nobody can sit down with all the facts that are supposedly known, and just make it all fit. That's a frustration that everyone has felt, including me. Confess, I urged him. It will haunt you forever. It will drive you crazy. I don't know if that's a word of advice, a backhanded comfort, or what, Rayleigh said. I am not guilty. I didn't do it. I don't feel tormented by the guilt of what I didn't do. It would be the next day before I understood some of what disturbed me about my conversation with Walker Rayleigh. There was, of course, the possibility of his innocence. If he was guilty of no more than infidelity, then what an awful fate for him to bear. How cruel of me to disbelieve him. But if he strangled Peggy and was going free, then what kind of person was he? I still didn't know. I had been struck, in a literary way, by the metaphorical parallels between Peggy's condition and that of her children, who were in a custody limbo, and that of the congregation, which was still stunned and bewildered, and that of the crime, which continued to be unsolved, and that of Walker, who was, as I pointed out to him, suspended between one life and another. Yes, yes, he said with an eager intensity that surprised me. Somebody asked me 3 or 4 months ago, how have you been? And I said I kind of feel like I'm in an emotional coma, in that I'm breathing, existing, and living, but at that point, this is while I was still in the hospital, like anybody in a coma, like Peggy and others. I hear people around me talking and making decisions that affect my life, and at this point I don't seem to have any control over those decisions. So I'm kind of in a fixed state. I guess you could say the same thing now. Perhaps it was the very eagerness with which he accepted this observation that chilled me, because of course there was no real equivalence between Walker Rayleigh's tragedy and Peggy's. Soon after our interview, he left to start a new life in California, but Peggy's life would never start again. And what will become of the congregation he leaves behind? It is in many respects his congregation, much of it comprising people like me, who had felt let down by the churches of their youth, and who had been drawn back to faith by Rayleigh's radiant ministry. They shared a common belief in the goodness of Walker Rayleigh. Now they were having to consider whether what they had taken as good was actually evil, or worse, far worse, that they would never really know the truth, and for the rest of their lives they would be bewildered. The truth would never be known, charges would never be filed, Peggy would neither die nor live again, and Walker Rayleigh would never be revealed as either hero or villain, but instead would haunt them forever, asking, "Who am I?" Case 3. It was the afternoon of September 21st, 2020. The officer in charge of the operation, a 22-year police veteran named Travis Edelman, stepped onto the front porch and rang the doorbell. A 77-year-old man opened the door wearing a gray polo shirt, blue jeans, and black dress shoes with white socks. Although he was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds, he appeared frail. His thinning hair, white with strands of gray, was brushed back over his head, and his brown eyes were sunken into his face. "Mr. Glenn McCurley?" Edelman asked. He didn't wait for an answer. "You're under arrest. Please step outside and do it now." McCurley seemed bewildered. He turned and looked at his wife, Judy, who had appeared beside him, wearing a bathrobe and leaning on a cane. As the officers handcuffed McCurley, Judy told Edelman that her husband was sick with cancer and that he was scheduled to see a doctor later that day. "Ma'am," said Edelman, "your husband has to come with us." McCurley had resided in West Fort Worth for nearly 50 years. He liked working with his hands and watching home improvement shows on television. Each week, he drove Judy to Walmart to buy groceries, and occasionally, they'd go to Polito's, a Mexican restaurant just a few minutes down the road. On Sundays, he and Judy worshipped at a nearby church. He seemed to be a good man leading a quiet life. One woman had even sent a letter to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram praising him and Judy for returning her lost wallet. "The world needs more folks like this," she wrote. But detectives had developed an entirely different perspective on McCurley. They had compelling evidence that he was responsible for the notorious, unsolved murder of a teenage girl in 1974. And they suspected that wasn't McCurley's only heinous crime. They considered him a person of interest in at least 3 other killings of young women during the 70s and 80s. Carla Walker with Rodney McCoy, courtesy of the Walker family. In 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old junior at Fort Worth's Western Hills High School. She was almost irrepressibly convivial, the kind of girl who smiled and said hello to just about everyone she saw in the hallways, a former schoolmate told me. Everyone at Western Hills liked Carla. Just 4'11", Carla had a thick mane of honey blonde hair that fell below her shoulders. She was dating Rodney McCoy, a wiry, good-natured kid who was quarterback of the football team. Rodney and Carla talked about enrolling together at Texas Tech University. She told her closest friends that she had no doubt she and Rodney would someday marry and start a family. The evening of February 16th, Rodney arrived at the Walkers' cozy home in Benbrook, in far west Fort Worth, to take Carla to the school's Valentine's Day dance. When Carla walked down the stairs from her bedroom, she was proudly wearing the promise ring he'd given her. He pinned a corsage to her powder blue dress, then drove her in his mother's car, a 1969 Ford LTD, to the school cafeteria, which had been decorated with pink streamers and paper hearts. The evening's theme was love as a kaleidoscope, and throughout the night students danced to a live band called Hydra. When the event ended, around 11:30, Rodney invited another couple to cruise Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle with him and Carla. They stopped at a couple of teen hangouts, Mr. Quick Hamburgers and Taco Bell. Later, after dropping off the others, Rodney and Carla drove to a nearby bowling alley, Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, so that she could use the bathroom. When she climbed back into the car, they started kissing. Carla leaned back against the passenger door, using her purse as a pillow. Then the passenger door flew open. Rodney would later say that he caught a glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair. The assailant was wearing a vest. He began bludgeoning Rodney over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point, the gun's magazine clip dislodged and fell to the parking lot. The man grabbed Carla. Rodney, barely conscious, heard him say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" "Rodney, go get my dad," Carla said. "Go get my dad." Rodney came to in the driver's seat sometime around 1 a.m. He sped to the Walkers' home, which was less than a mile away. He drove up over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed on the brakes. Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake, playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Carla's little brother Jim, who was 12 years old, and her elder sister Cindy, who was 18, were in the living room watching television. They heard someone banging at the front door and were stunned to see Rodney, blood dripping down his face. He was frantic. "Mr. Walker, they've got her," he shouted. "They're gonna hurt her bad." Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, grabbed his pistol and raced to the bowling alley. Doris dialed the operator on the family's rotary phone and asked to be connected to the police. Officers soon arrived at the scene. Searching the parking lot, they found Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had been ejected from the assailant's weapon. Other cops drove the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any sign of Carla. After the sun rose, more joined the hunt. Peering through binoculars, a few circled the city in helicopters. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High. They studied contact sheets of photos taken at the dance, looking for anyone who seemed out of place. They stopped kids in the hallways, asking if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Carla. In the early 70s, Fort Worth's population was roughly 400,000, less than half its size today. Local boosters promoted the city as a safe, family-oriented haven. "In our neighborhood, people didn't even lock their doors," Carla's sister Cindy told me. "I know this sounds strange, but we were so naive about crime back then that we simply couldn't imagine that Carla was dead." We figured that someone was going to drive by the house and drop Carla off, and we'd all move on from there. But on February 20th, 4 days after Carla's disappearance, 2 of the officers assigned to look for her were driving along a remote two-lane road near Benbrook Lake, about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They spotted a culvert, a concrete tunnel built to let water flow beneath the road, and pulled over to peer inside. They saw a young woman lying on her back, her face and neck covered with scratches and deep bruises. It was Carla. Her blue dress was bloody and ripped in several places. Her bra was pushed up above her breasts, and her underwear and pantyhose were wadded up together at the entrance to the culvert. She had been strangled. Because there were no ligature marks around her neck, investigators believed that the killer had choked her using his hands. Carla's parents were asked to come to the hospital morgue to identify her. Jim went with them. Someone took Mom and Dad down the hall to look at her, and my mom started to scream, he told me. I had never heard anyone make a sound like that. It was like an animal sound that will stay with me for as long as I live. Police searching the culvert where Carla's body was found in 1974. Fort Worth Star-Telegram / the University of Texas at Arlington Special Collections. News of Carla's murder covered almost the entire front page of the Star-Telegram. Her funeral, which was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, was attended by more than 1,250 mourners, far more than the small sanctuary could hold. As they walked past Carla's open casket, her friends were overcome with grief. They were also terrified. They stopped cruising up and down Camp Bowie Boulevard after school, and some would no longer leave their houses at night. Kathy O'Neill, the editor of the high school yearbook that year, babysat in the neighborhood. She had to call her parents the moment she arrived, to let them know she was safe. Others signed up for self-defense classes that were arranged by the Western Hills High PDA and taught by 2 men who held black belts in jiu-jitsu. Fort Worth officials formed a task force of detectives from area police departments, but the group didn't have much to investigate. No fingerprints had been identified on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress had come from Rodney's head wounds. Traces of bodily fluid had been found, but the technology did not yet exist to identify a person from their DNA. In that era, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots, no license plate readers on the sides of highways. We didn't even have computers in our police departments, Jim Minter, one of the task force detectives, told me. The group did set up a 24-hour telephone tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks, sipping lukewarm coffee, and listening to citizens pass on the names of men they believed had killed Carla. The detectives were told by various callers that Carla had been murdered by a pair of marijuana dealers, by a carnival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, and by a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where Carla had been kidnapped. They heard stories about a boy who had supposedly gotten into an argument with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburger's the night before the dance. They also got a call from a man who wouldn't give his name. He claimed he knew the murderer, who he said hadn't meant to kill Carla and had only wanted to F her. The detectives also hired a hypnotist to try to draw more details out of Rodney, who suffered a head injury during the incident. But the most significant memory he managed to recall was that Carla's kidnapper had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers and Rodney awoke, the boy burst into tears. A scared kid, all torn up inside, tormented that he didn't do enough to save his girlfriend, Minter recalled. During one meeting, the task force detectives did discuss another unsolved murder that had taken place on February 7, 1973, almost exactly a year before Carla's. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin didn't return home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was found almost 7 weeks later. It was so decomposed that there was no way to determine the cause of death. The medical examiner said Martin could have been stabbed or strangled, or even shot through the stomach. But what most intrigued the detectives about Martin's murder was where her body had been found, in a culvert just outside the city limits. 2 dead girls in 2 culverts, a year apart. It just seemed too coincidental, said Minter. Although they said nothing publicly, the investigators began looking for a serial killer. By March, a month after Carla's killing, all the task force had to go on was one small lead. The detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer model .22 Ruger handgun. They asked the federal government's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to provide them the names of anyone living in Fort Worth who had purchased that model. The ATF came up with a list of a couple dozen people, and the task force set out to interview each of them. One man on the list was a 31-year-old truck driver named Glenn McCurley. He was raised in West Texas, the eldest of 3 boys. His father, Glenn McCurley Sr., served with the Army in World War II and later became an insurance adjuster. According to one person who knew the family, Glenn Sr. was proud of his 2 younger sons, who were athletes and good students, but thought McCurley was undisciplined and a troublemaker. When McCurley was a teenager, his parents sent him to the Westview Boys' Home in southwestern Oklahoma. Westview, which is sponsored by the Churches of Christ, promotes itself as a place for those who are deprived due to sickness or death in their family, boys experiencing significant problems in living with their family, boys needing supervision, runaways or truants, delinquent boys, those who have violated the law but who are not in need of treatment or detention, and abandoned, abused or neglected boys. It's not clear why McCurley was sent to the home or precisely how long he was there, but his stay clearly wasn't transformative. By February 1961, he'd left Westview and was in Abilene, where he stole a car. Then he abandoned that car and stole another one. The State Highway Patrol began to pursue him and shot out one of his tires. He drove the vehicle onto a vacant lot and attempted to escape on foot, but was quickly captured. "Youth accused of auto theft here," was the headline in the next day's Abilene Reporter News. In court, McCurley pleaded guilty and received a 2-year sentence. He was released early, in the spring of 1962, when he was 19, and eventually moved to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. The daughter of an oil field worker, she was an earnest student and a member of the Business Education Club. According to someone who knew her, she was a good girl who hadn't dated much. McCurley captivated her. He was a big guy with close-cropped brown hair, dark brown eyes, Johnny Cash sideburns, and an endearing dimpled grin. On February 16, 1963, McCurley married Judy in a Baptist church. At the reception, a photographer snapped a picture of them cutting the cake. The young couple moved into a small rental home. McCurley eventually got a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service, with a route to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Judy gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Then, in 1972, McCurley moved his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. McCurley and Judy enrolled their boys in the public elementary school, and they joined Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley got another truck driving job, hauling prefabricated slabs of concrete to construction sites. Judy worked at their church's daycare center. Parents at the center loved Judy. She was affectionate with the children, warm and motherly, one of the parents told me. McCurley wasn't as personable as his wife, but he maintained a good reputation. In his free time, he dropped by Ridgely West Baptist to mow the lawn and make any needed repairs around the church. He performed odd jobs for his neighbors, tinkering with their car engines and replacing faulty electrical wiring in their homes. One man who knew McCurley did note a distasteful habit. He'd see a pretty girl and say something like, "Take a look at that," he told me. But he never said anything vulgar about her, at least not to me. He wasn't, what's the word, creepy. In early March 1974, 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's home to interview him about his Ruger .22 pistol. When the officers asked about the gun, McCurley said it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He then agreed to come downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. The task force promptly eliminated him as a potential suspect. "As much as it pains me to say this, we didn't think about McCurley again," Minter told me. An aerial view of Glenn McCurley's neighborhood in 2022. Photographed by Trevor Paulhus. By late spring 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Meanwhile, at Western Hills High, students raised money to pay for a memorial to Carla, a tile plaque of a cougar, the school's mascot, which administrators installed on the floor of the front hallway. Black ropes hanging from metal stanchions surrounded the plaque so that no one could walk on it. "We wanted to make sure Carla was never forgotten," Kenny Carnes-Myers, Carla's close friend since childhood, told me. "Our hope was to create a place where everyone could come and remember just what kind of special person Carla was." In the spring of 1975, those classmates graduated. By fall 1976, when Carla's little brother Jim arrived at Western Hills High for his freshman year, Carla's name wasn't mentioned in the hallways like it once was. Students chatted happily to one another as they walked past her memorial. Jim tried to avoid the plaque. A personable kid with thick brown hair that fell over his ears. He wanted to move on with his life. Still, there were times he would come across Carla's memorial and feel overwhelmed. Our family had been destroyed by Carla's murder, Jim told me. Every morning, my mom would slip back to her bathroom, stand in the shower without the water running and weep. I never saw my dad cry. He was a military man, you know. But for the first few years after Carla's murder, I didn't see him smile either. During those years, strangers would occasionally call the Walkers' house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about Carla's killer. Leighton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box, said Jim. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the killer lived. He was not going to rest, he told me, until he knew Carla's killer was behind bars. When Jim turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the killer. Sometimes, on the anniversary of Carla's death, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the killer, Jim said. My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away, maybe somewhere out in West Texas, where no one could hear him scream. Jim would occasionally jog down Vickery Boulevard, past a street called Mark's Place. On that street, in a small, tan, one-story house, lived Glenn McCurley and his family. Jim had no idea who the McCurleys were. He'd never even met the family's eldest son, Craig, who was 2 years behind him at Western Hills High. Who knows? Jim said. Maybe our families stood in the same line at the grocery store, or we pulled up to the same traffic light on Camp Bowie Boulevard, or we sat next to one another at Polito's. Every year, we had a big family garage sale, which brought out a lot of people in the neighborhood. I've always thought Glenn McCurley might have stopped at one of our garage sales. If the two had met, it's doubtful McCurley would have triggered any alarms. When he wasn't on the road for his job, McCurley built and sold picnic tables, barbecue pits, and firewood stands. He and Judy seemed to enjoy a healthy marriage. A man who was friends with Craig told me that Craig's dad never said or did anything that I thought was in any way inappropriate. To me, Mr. McCurley was just another dad in the neighborhood. A photo of Carla Walker and family, photographed by Trevor Paulhus. On February 19, 1977, almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse, lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. Ward was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She had been strangled and beaten over the head with what one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the two crimes. And then on July 9, 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Hoff, described in the newspapers as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in southeast Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2.5 years later, in February 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the famous Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire, and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other killings, the Tower case remained a mystery, though a few days after her murder, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Tower's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Camp Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February 1974. City residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial killer, a fear that law enforcement officials said was unfounded. But such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9, 1984. Davis was found in a field in far south Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19, Marilyn Hartman, a 29-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. A mere 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty pageant contestant, was last seen near Hullen Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek on the TCU campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26th, Katherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after Jackson's killing, Angela Ewart, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. And on the evening of December 22nd, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been bludgeoned to death. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. An editorialist in the Star-Telegram fanned more fear by declaring that the recent spate of murders was most likely being carried out by one or more extremely sick persons, consumed by a passion for killing, particularly for killing attractive young women. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect, from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in murders. The killer, if it was one killer, seemed to have retreated. Until February 24, 1986, when a passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket, lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but the police couldn't identify her through the usual means, fingerprints or dental records. Nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another. And this time, it really did appear as if the killer had retreated for good. Short of someone showing up at the police department to confess, the detectives were unable to imagine solving any of the Fort Worth killings. But Carla Walker's little brother Jim had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial killers and took courses in abnormal psychology, so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. "My plan was to get promoted to detective, get my hands on Carla's files, and find her killer," he told me. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local office of defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for Carla's killer. After his father died, in 1987, of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Layton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother died of Alzheimer's, in 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. "I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess," he said. Jim also regularly called the Fort Worth Police Department's cold case unit to ask about developments in Carla's murder investigation. He always got the same answer: "Sorry, nothing new has emerged. We'll let you know when we get a break." When Jim called the unit in January 2018, he was 56 years old and working as a vocational rehabilitation counselor for the state of Texas. His eyesight had steadily deteriorated to the point that he needed a guide dog to help him get around. Jim left a voicemail. A detective named Leah Wagner returned the call. Wagner had joined the department in 2000, first working in patrol before being named detective in 2013. She eventually was promoted to the homicide division and focused on active cases. But in 2018, she moved to the cold case unit. Some cops have no patience for cold cases. They can't imagine spending their days hunkered down at a desk, poring over barely legible incident reports from years ago, searching for physical evidence that almost certainly no longer exists, and looking for witnesses who have moved away, forgotten what they saw, or died. Wagner, however, was intrigued by the work. "Your chances of success are never high, but I love that aha moment when you put the pieces of a puzzle together," she told me. "There's a thrill in figuring out something that up to that point nobody else has been able to solve." Wagner was, at that time, the sole staffer in the cold case unit. When Jim got her on the phone, she admitted to knowing nothing about Carla's case. Jim filled her in and added, "If the person who killed her is still alive, he's got to be getting on in years. Please, we're running out of daylight." Wagner's office, a small, windowless cubicle, adjoined a storage room filled with nearly 1,000 files documenting unsolved murders dating back to 1959. After speaking to Jim, Wagner went looking for Carla's files. They were on a bottom shelf, stuffed into 2 large brown banker's boxes. She started reading, but she didn't get far. Her supervisors sent her to take over the active cases of a detective who had fallen seriously ill. It wasn't until January 2019, a year after she'd first talked to Jim, that she returned to her cold case job. By then, more files had stacked up on her desk. She asked her supervisors for some help. They had the perfect solution. They sent her a reserve officer named Jeff Bennett. Reserve officers perform various duties for police departments, typically on a volunteer basis. Bennett, a trim, middle-aged man who works in the commercial construction business, had been helping the department since 1997, working mostly nights in the patrol division responding to 911 calls. "I liked my day job, but law enforcement was my passion," he told me. "I felt like it was my chance to make a contribution." Bennett had let his superiors know he was interested in doing detective work. His timing couldn't have been better. He was sent to the cold case unit, where Wagner showed him the Carla Walker boxes. Bennett carried them to his home office and immediately began reading. There were original police reports, an autopsy report, and summations of interviews that detectives had conducted with friends and acquaintances of Carla. He worked obsessively, sometimes through the night, and eventually came up with an exhaustive list of roughly 80 people of interest he thought would be worth re-interviewing. Wagner and Bennett asked Jim and his older sister, Cindy, to come downtown so they could introduce themselves. Jim brought along his guide dog, a black Labrador retriever named Cassie, who lay quietly on the floor as he sat down to talk with the officers. The detectives asked Jim and Cindy if they had any hunches about who might have killed Carla. "We have no idea," Jim replied. Cindy told the investigators she now had 4 grandchildren. "And I'm still scared of letting them out of my sight," she confided, wiping tears from her eyes. "All we want to know is who did it and why." The detectives began the laborious process of tracking down everyone on Bennett's list. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her murder, which he occasionally reread. A likely sign, said the ex-wife, that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla was murdered. What the detectives needed was physical evidence, and the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the killer's DNA. Since Carla's death, the technology of DNA identification had not only been developed, but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians use freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner and Bennett, Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night of her murder had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians could still turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of Carla's killer. What's more, conducting DNA tests on Carla's clothes could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000, money that was more likely to go toward active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead, but they knew the odds were against them. Then their investigation took an unpredictable turn. Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff. He had a neatly trimmed beard and tattoos covering both arms, and he often wore black t-shirts featuring various punk bands. Strange, by the way, is a pseudonym. He prefers to keep his real name private. One day in 2017, he told his wife, Erica, that he planned to create a podcast about unsolved murders in Texas. He said his first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose murder he had read about while poking around the internet. Strange set up some inexpensive recording equipment in a bedroom in his home and began interviewing Jim and Cindy and a couple of Carla's friends. He and Erica wrote the script, and Jim voiced it himself, sounding a little like the horror movie actor Vincent Price, only with a Texas accent. The show, called Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime, had a small audience at first, but one person who did listen to it was Diane Kuykendall, a retired mail clerk for the U.S. Postal Service in Fort Worth. I had gone to high school with Carla, she told me. We didn't know each other at all, but she had always smiled at me in the hallway. She made me feel good, the popular girl talking to someone like me. Listening to the podcast, I thought, I wish there was some way I could pay her back. Kuykendall decided to fly to Nashville to attend CrimeCon, an annual 3-day true crime convention that most recently attracted some 5,000 fans, the majority of them women, who flocked to see celebrity authors, podcasters, and broadcasters. She brought along 80 copies of a pamphlet she'd written about Carla's case, which was based mostly on Strange's podcast. She paced the hallways of the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center, passing out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holes, a retired homicide investigator who'd helped solve the Golden State Killer case, and who hosted a true crime show on NBC's Oxygen Network. I'm sure everyone thought I was one of those crazy true crime ladies, Kuykendall told me. Holes was intrigued by Carla's case, and in April 2019, his producers called Wagner and Bennett. Oxygen was willing to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. The detectives were thrilled. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid, not on Carla's dress, but on a barely visible stain on the strap of her bra. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Holes and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. Holes devoted an episode of his television show to the failed hunt for Carla's killer, and that seemed to be that. But after the episode aired, Holes introduced Wagner and Bennett to David Middleman, CEO of Othram, a forensic DNA testing lab located in the Woodlands, just outside Houston. Middleman had spoken to Holes about Carla's case, and he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. Because so much of the DNA from Carla's bra strap had been used by the other laboratories in their tests, there was barely enough left to conduct a final analysis. The safe play for Wagner and Bennett would have been to store the DNA and wait for newer technology to emerge. But the detectives rolled the dice. They had their last sample from the bra strap shipped to Othram. The morning of July 4th, 2020, Middleman called Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." Bennett began leafing through his binders and took a deep breath. He asked Middleman if anyone in that McCurley family tree was named Glenn Samuel McCurley. "Yes," said Middleman, "there's a Glenn Samuel McCurley Sr., but he died in 1972, 2 years before Carla's murder." "Was there a Glenn McCurley Jr.?" Bennett asked. Middleman said he'd check. He hung up and called Bennett back later that day. There was indeed a Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., and he'd been living in Fort Worth at the time of the killing. Bennett took another breath. Glenn McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger .22 had been stolen. Wagner and Bennett did a background check on McCurley, but there was little to learn. As far as they could tell, other than his 1961 criminal conviction for stealing a car when he was 18, he'd had no encounters with police. Over the years, he had maintained a good reputation in his neighborhood. In 1988, the McCurleys' eldest son, Craig, who was just 24, was hit and killed by a drunk driver. Neighbors came by the house with dinners for McCurley and Judy. Glenn was devastated Craig was gone. A person who knew the family told me. McCurley was no longer driving trucks full-time by then. He took on handyman jobs and did part-time maintenance work at a fitness club. Although he wasn't educated, I thought, in his own way, he was sort of brilliant, said a woman who worked there. He could fix anything, dryers, equipment, treadmills. When I asked if she had ever noticed McCurley eyeing any of the younger females who worked out at the club, she replied, "Never." McCurley also popped up every now and then on Judy's Facebook page. She clearly adored him. She once posted a photo of her husband at their 1963 wedding reception in Midland. On one of his birthdays, Judy posted another photo of him as a young man. To me, he still looks like this today, she declared. I hope you find out who killed Carla, Judy told the detectives. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered. Wagner and Bennett decided to pay him a visit. They arrived unannounced at the McCurley's home. Judy and Glenn politely invited the detectives into the living room and chatted amiably. Wagner and Bennett were recording the conversation. McCurley talked about his old truck driving gigs. Judy said she had spent 32 years at Ridgely West Baptist's daycare program, finally retiring in 2004 because of health issues. She also mentioned that her husband suffered from diabetes and that he'd recently had surgery to remove a tumor the size of a quarter on his liver. We're not ready for this, Judy said of his cancer. Judy kept on. She told the detectives about Craig's death. We've had our ups and downs. She said that their younger son Roddy lived with his wife and children outside Fort Worth. Finally, McCurley asked the detectives, his voice raspy, "What do y'all want to talk about?" "We're going to take you way back," Wagner said. "Back in 1974, y'all were living here at the time, so you may have heard about it. There was a young lady kidnapped from a bowling alley." "I know exactly which one you're talking about," Judy immediately said. "Carla Walker." Judy later told the detectives she could remember where the Walker family lived, on Williams Road. "They kept her room the same way it was," she said. "They kept her car still parked in the driveway for years and years. You'd drive by and see that car parked in the driveway. It was just absolutely heartbreaking." Wagner said that she and Bennett had reopened the murder investigation and were contacting those who had been interviewed by the police in 1974. "It's a huge case," she said, "and we saw at one point they talked to you, Mr. McCurley." Wagner asked McCurley if she could take a DNA sample. "It would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect," she explained. McCurley hesitated. Then he took a pen, signed a consent form, and opened his mouth so Wagner could dab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Looking on, Judy told the detectives, "I hope you find out who killed Carla. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered." A culvert at Benbrook Lake in 2022. Photographed by Trevor Paulhus. 11 days later, after lab techs verified that the DNA from McCurley's cheek perfectly matched the DNA found on Carla's bra strap, the members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at his house to arrest him. He was driven downtown to the police department, where he waived his right to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. For several minutes, he sat alone in an interview room. Wagner and Bennett walked in. "Hi," said Wagner. "Do you remember us?" She placed a photo of Carla on the table. "We are here to discuss the murder of this young lady." McCurley looked briefly at the picture. "I don't know who she is," he said. Bennett pointed at the photo and said, "Mr. McCurley, can you look at that picture and just tell us for sure that you do not know who she is?" McCurley picked it up and examined it more closely. "I've never seen her before," he said. "I wouldn't know her if she was standing beside me." "Carla was 17 years old, Wagner said. "She had a family. She had a boyfriend that she was going to marry, and you took that away from her." Wagner continued, referencing McCurley's cancer. "You are sick," she said. "How are you going to make things right before you pass away if you don't admit to the things that you've done?" Bennett leaned forward in his chair and asked McCurley who else he might have killed. "There were a lot of homicides that occurred during that time," he said, "and we're trying to find out if you're this mean, ugly serial killer, or if this is just something that happened that night and was a mistake." McCurley continued to deny he had ever met Carla. For more than an hour, he wouldn't budge. Then Wagner tried a different approach. "I imagine it's been difficult to keep this from your wife all these years," she said. "Y'all have been married for over 50-something years. I'm sure she's your best friend. You do everything together. You tell her everything, and you've had this one secret that you've kept all this time. We know that you want to get this off your chest," Bennett added. "It's been too long. It's been too many years. Her family deserves answers." McCurley finally began to crack. "Then I go to the electric chair," he said, his voice barely audible. "I get hung or whatever." He said that if he were sent away to prison, "I can't take care of my wife." Wagner assured him that his son Roddy would watch after Judy. "You know why?" she asked. "Because I think you raised him to be that kind of man." McCurley fixed his gaze on the floor. He barely moved. "Okay," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "I did do it, I guess." He told the detectives that on the afternoon of February 16, 1974, he'd drunk whiskey and beer for several hours. He said he began driving around and parked in some parking lots. At one point, he drove to the bowling ball place. It seemed as if McCurley were about to confess. Instead, he told the detectives he'd heard a girl screaming in a nearby car. I went over there to see if I could help. This big guy had her up and against the door, jerking her around. McCurley said he opened the front passenger door, got into a tussle with the boy, pushed him off Carla, led her back to his car, and then drove her to another parking lot. She started hugging me, thanking me, and one thing led to another, said McCurley. I did have sex with her. He claimed he then let her out of the car. I don't remember too much from there on. Doing her best to appear sympathetic to him, Wagner told McCurley that she and Bennett had learned Carla was a virgin. If she wasn't having sex with her high school boyfriend, Wagner said, people are going to have a really hard time believing that she was going to willingly have sex with you. McCurley repeatedly denied that he had raped Carla, but he did say that after they finished having sex, he started choking her because he was afraid she'd tell on me or something. But he said Carla was still alive when he drove away. How do you know? Asked Wagner. Well, she was standing up by herself against the car, McCurley said. The more McCurley talked, the more confounding his claims became. For instance, he never mentioned Carla's body being stuffed into a culvert. He said he had left her next to a building near the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, down toward the Mexican eating place down there at the red light. Bennett wondered if McCurley was mixing up the details of Carla's killing with a different murder. Is there another girl that you might have done this to as well? He asked. No, I only did one night, McCurley said. Are you sure? Pretty sure. Pretty sure, asked Bennett. How many times did this occur, Mr. McCurley? What killing people? He asked. Never. The next day, at a crowded news conference at the downtown Fort Worth Police Department, officials announced McCurley's arrest for Carla's murder. Wagner and Bennett were introduced, as was Jim Walker. Finally, after 46 years, 5 months, and 3 days, we have a name and a face, Walker said, exultant. After speaking to his court-appointed attorneys, McCurley pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued in their court filings that the Othram Labs DNA test was flawed and that Wagner and Bennett had coerced McCurley into a false confession. The attorneys also portrayed McCurley as feeble and dying of cancer. This man poses no threat to anyone, one of the lawyers told me. As far as I can tell, he has led an utterly uneventful life. Prosecutors, however, persuaded a judge to set McCurley's bond at $500,000. To just look at him and say he's sick, or he is old, or he hasn't had a criminal history isn't the proper analysis in this case, said Kimberly Davignon, an assistant district attorney with the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. You have to go back and consider the heinousness of this crime and the impact it had on Fort Worth in 1974. In many ways, Fort Worth was never the same after Carla was killed. 9 months later, on June 16, 2021, at the first pretrial hearing open to the public, Judy and her son Roddy showed up. They stood in the hallway, visibly discomfited. Jim was also there with his wife, Beverly. He asked Beverly to lead him over to Roddy. I'm Carla Walker's little brother, Jim said. Roddy struggled to respond. I'm sorry, he eventually replied, breaking into sobs. Jim wasn't sure what to do. For years, he had been thinking of ways he would exact revenge on his sister's killer, and now here he was, face to face with the killer's son, and he didn't feel a bit of anger. It's not your fault, Jim reassured him. Roddy continued to cry, and Jim found himself wrapping his arms around him. You are not responsible for the sins of your dad, Jim said. Your dad devastated your family, just like he devastated mine. The courtroom doors opened. Wearing a green jail-issued jumpsuit, McCurley was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair. He turned to the gallery, glanced briefly at his wife, and blew her a kiss. Judy was distraught. McCurley had been her loyal husband, or so she had thought, for nearly 60 years. When the actual trial got underway, a few months later, Carla's boyfriend Rodney testified about the night she vanished. Retired homicide detective Jim Minner took the stand to talk about the original investigation into Carla's murder, and Wagner and Bennett testified about their own police work. Prosecutors Davignon and Emily Dixon unfolded the powder blue dress Carla had been wearing the night she was abducted and presented it to the jury. They also played 3 hours of the videotaped interview that Wagner and Bennett had conducted with McCurley after his arrest. And then the prosecutors revealed a surprise piece of evidence, McCurley's .22 Ruger, which he claimed had been stolen. Police had discovered it during a search of his home, hidden away in a compartment above a door. The case, of course, was open and shut. On the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, and the judge quickly sentenced him to life in prison. Jim and Cindy were allowed to make witness impact statements. Jim elected to stand directly in front of McCurley. You've done this to other families, Jim said, and you need to confess and bring closure to these other victims' families. McCurley kept his eyes fixed on the floor. McCurley at the Gibb Lewis unit in December 2021. Photographed by Trevor Paulhus. In the aftermath of the trial, there were still a lot of questions. Why would Glenn McCurley, a man with no violent criminal record, have committed such a sadistic murder? Was it an impulsive, drunken act? Or was McCurley a depraved serial killer who was also responsible for the murders of other young Fort Worth women? And if he was a serial killer, why did he suddenly stop in the mid-80s? Did he have a genuine change of heart? Was that even possible? Wagner and Bennett told reporters that they were investigating McCurley for possible connections to a handful of other slayings, including the February 1973 murder of Becky Martin, the junior college student who went missing almost exactly 1 year before Carla's abduction. Hoping to raise money to pay for DNA testing of yet more cold cases, Bennett formed a non-profit foundation called the FWPD Cold Case Support Group. Jim Walker himself joined the board, promising to donate to the foundation some of the profits from the sale of his family home, which he plans to put on the market in a couple of years. I don't need to be living here anymore, thinking about my mom crying in her bathroom, or my dad with his metal box, he told me recently. I don't need to be reminded of Carla's murder every time I walk down the hallway. It's time to let things go. When I asked after his wife and his son, McCurley said they hadn't written or visited. I guess they now believe I did all those things the police said I did. Judy, Roddy, and other members of McCurley's family declined my interview requests. This past December, however, McCurley let me visit him at the Gibb Lewis unit, the prison where he's incarcerated, about an hour north of Beaumont in the far east Texas town of Woodville. I met him in one of the prison's visitation rooms, where we were separated by glass. He was still in his wheelchair, and his health had visibly declined. "It's all the cancer," he said. "I can't imagine that I have too much longer to live." When I asked after his wife and his son, McCurley said they hadn't written or visited. I guess they now believe I did all those things the police said I did. It's all a bunch of lies, you know. He seemed close to tears. I'm no desperado. I never did anything violent. I never hurt any woman. He paused for a few seconds. Why would I want to kill a woman? During our hour together, McCurley gave me no hints about why he had strangled Carla, or anyone else, for that matter. When I asked about his childhood, he said he'd gotten along fine with his parents, and that the only trouble he got into was a few fights at school. My parents didn't want me to make a career out of it, so they sent me to the boys' home, he said. He told me that when he met Judy, she was a blonde-headed gal, and she was from a nice family and was a nice girl, and I just fell in love with her. His sons, he said, were special boys. He paused again. I was lucky to have a nice family. When I asked him about the night Carla was murdered, he told me the same story he'd told Wagner and Bennett, except for one major change. He said he and Carla, whom he called that girl, never had sex, but rather that he drove her to another parking lot, cleaned her up, and returned her to the bowling alley, where some of her friends were waiting. I didn't put a hand on her, he said. That's ridiculous, McCurley continued. And that girl I saved wasn't wearing a blue prom dress. That's a lie the police told. She had on some pedal pusher pants and a brown sweater and some kind of white-looking shoes. Like Bennett, I couldn't help but think that McCurley's memory was slipping and that he was recalling a separate crime. Are you sure that's what Carla was wearing? I asked. It was a long time ago. McCurley gave me an obstinate stare. I remember what she wore, he said. Why, then I asked, did he end his own trial with a guilty plea? I'd had enough hounding, he said, exasperated. The judge wouldn't let me talk. Everybody believed that policewoman and policeman, but nobody was hearing my side of the story. We kept talking. I mentioned the names of the other women that Wagner and Bennett suspected him of murdering. I didn't kill any of those girls, he said. Not one of them. I've never killed anything except for some birds and deer. And if I did kill those girls, wouldn't I have tried to hide? I've had the same phone number in Fort Worth for 50 years. It's bullshit what the police say about me. At one point, I suggested that if one man had murdered Carla and all those other young women, he must have been ingenious to repeatedly escape the scrutiny of multiple police task forces. For a moment McCurley looked directly at me. I thought he was about to say something, but instead he shook his head. A guard arrived. My hour with McCurley was up, and I realized I had learned nothing new about him. I raised my hand and said goodbye. Then he beckoned to me, indicating he had one more thing to say. I'm sorry I cussed a little bit right then, saying the word bullshit to you, he told me. He looked stricken. I'm not the kind of man who cusses in front of others. And then he was gone.